When Catherine Reed raised her father's Colt 45 at the dusty stranger emerging from the Montana wilderness, she had no idea this moment would define not just her survival, but her destiny. What happens when a woman who refuses to be tamed meets a cowboy who sees her fire as freedom? Stay with me until the end of this epic tale of love, danger, and defiance in the untamed West, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across our beautiful country. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching August sun of 1872, its golden grasslands shimmering like ocean waves in the heat. Dust devils danced across the barren landscape, and the only sound for miles was the relentless buzz of cicadas hidden in the sparse scrub brush. It was in this godforsaken stretch of wilderness that Catherine Reed found herself stranded her father's ancient stagecoach, listing dangerously to one side like a wounded animal. The wheel had given up the ghost 3 miles back with a crack that echoed across the prairie like a gunshot. Catherine had fought the reins as the coach lurched and groaned to a stop, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized the full scope of her predicament. She was alone, truly alone in a land where being alone could mean death. Standing beside the crippled coach, Catherine wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her gloved hand and surveyed the damage. The front left wheel had split clean through its iron rim buried in the sun-baked earth. Her leather traveling bags sat in the dust where she'd unloaded them, containing everything she owned in the world. 3 dresses, 2 pairs of boots, her teaching certificates, and her mother's pearl necklace wrapped carefully in tissue paper. But it wasn't her meager possessions that concerned her most. It was the weight of her father's Colt 45 pressed against her hip beneath her dark blue traveling dress. Judge Marcus Reed had insisted she carry it when she'd announced her intention to travel west to Silver Creek, Montana Territory to take up the position of school teacher. "The frontier's no place for a lady traveling alone," he'd said gruffly, his weathered hands checking the gun's chambers one final time. "But if you're determined to go, you'll go prepared." Now, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became almost unbearable, Catherine began to understand the weight of his words. She had water for perhaps 2 days if she rationed carefully, and no food save for a small tin of crackers and some dried beef. The nearest settlement was Silver Creek, still 20 miles north according to her calculations, and the road behind her stretched empty all the way back to the railroad depot in Billings. She was contemplating her limited options when she heard it, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the north. Catherine's hand instinctively moved to her father's gun as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger and more defined with each passing second. In this lawless territory, a lone woman was prey to any manner of desperados, claim jumpers, and worse. The rider emerged from the heat shimmer like a phantom materialized from the very earth itself. He sat tall in the saddle of a magnificent bay stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the endless sky. Even at a distance, Catherine could see he was a big man, and the easy confidence with which he rode suggested someone comfortable with violence. A weather-beaten hat shadowed his face, and she caught the glint of metal at his hip that could only mean one thing: gun. Catherine's fingers closed around the grip of her father's Colt, and in one fluid motion she drew the weapon and leveled it at the approaching stranger. The gun felt heavy and foreign in her hands, but her father had trained her well during those long afternoons behind their Boston mansion. She might be a school teacher, but she was Judge Reed's daughter first, and Reed women didn't cower. "That's far enough," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "State your business or ride on." The stranger reined in his horse about 30 yards away, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. For a long moment they regarded each other across the dusty expanse, the determined woman with the gun and the mysterious cowboy who'd appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. "Easy there, miss," came his voice, deep and rich with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps Arkansas. "Didn't mean to startle you. Saw your coach from the ridge and thought you might need assistance." Even with his hands raised, Catherine didn't lower her weapon. She'd heard too many stories of frontier bandits who used charm and courtesy as weapons, just as deadly as bullets. "I can manage my own affairs, thank you kindly. Now move along before I'm forced to demonstrate my father's instruction in marksmanship." The stranger let out a low chuckle that somehow managed to be both amused and respectful. "Your father taught you well, I can see that. Mind if I step down? My hands will stay where you can see them, and I'll keep my distance. Name's Jackson Blackwell, but most folks call me Jax. I run cattle about 10 miles north of here. Catherine studied him carefully as he slowly dismounted her gun, never wavering. He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to hard work and harder living, but there was something in his manner that suggested education and breeding beneath the rough exterior. His clothes were dusty from travel but well made, and his boots were expensive leather, not the crude footwear of a common drifter. Catherine Reed, she replied after a moment's hesitation, then immediately regretted giving her real name. And I'll keep my own counsel about whether I need assistance. Jax, if that was truly his name, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed strangely out of place in the wilderness. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Reed. Though I have to say, any woman brave enough to draw down on a stranger in the middle of nowhere either has more courage than sense, or more sense than most folks give her credit for. I've been accused of both, Catherine replied dryly, though she found herself oddly charmed by his manner. What makes you think I need help from a complete stranger? Well, for starters, that wheel's not going to fix itself, Jax observed, nodding toward the damaged coach. And unless you're planning to walk to wherever you're heading, you're going to need either a new wheel or a different mode of transportation. Catherine glanced at the broken wheel, then back at the man who stood with his hand still partially raised, making no move toward his own weapon. There was truth in his words, much as she hated to admit it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford in her current situation. Assuming for a moment that you're not a highwayman or worse, she said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? I've got tools and experience with wagon repairs back at my ranch, Jax replied. Could either fix this wheel or rig something temporary to get you to Silver Creek. That's where you're headed, isn't it? Saw the direction you were traveling. Catherine's eyes narrowed. How do you know I'm bound for Silver Creek? Process of elimination mostly. You're clearly not from around here, no offense, but that dress and those gloves mark you as Eastern stock. Silver Creek's the only settlement of any size north of here, and they've been advertising for a school teacher in papers as far away as Denver. An educated woman traveling alone with teaching materials? He shrugged. Wasn't hard to figure. Despite herself, Catherine was impressed by his deductive reasoning. It spoke to an intelligence that his rough appearance might have concealed from a casual observer. Still, she kept her gun trained on him. Very astute, Mr. Blackwell, but that doesn't explain why a cattle rancher would go out of his way to help a stranded stranger. Maybe I was raised to help folks in need, Jax replied simply. Or maybe I figure any woman brave enough to point a gun at a man twice her size and not back down is exactly the kind of person Silver Creek needs teaching their children. The compliment delivered without a trace of condescension caught Catherine off guard. In her experience, men either dismissed her capabilities entirely or praised them in a patronizing way that somehow made her feel smaller. This stranger, this Jax Blackwell, seemed to recognize her strength without feeling threatened by it. You're assuming I'm brave, Catherine said. For all you know, I could be terrified and simply too stubborn to show it. Fear and bravery aren't opposites, Miss Reed. In my experience, the bravest folks are usually the ones who are scared but do what needs doing anyway. There was something in his tone, a note of hard-won wisdom that made Catherine study him more carefully. Up close, she could see that Jackson Blackwell was younger than she'd first estimated, perhaps 30 years old, but his face bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into harsh sun and making difficult decisions. His eyes were a striking blue-gray like storm clouds over the ocean, and they held a directness that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Even assuming your intentions are honorable, Catherine said, though she was beginning to suspect they might be, how do I know you have the skills to repair my coach? For all I know, you could make things worse. Jack smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. Fair question. Tell you what, why don't you keep that gun handy while I take a look at the damage? If I can't fix it, or if you don't like my work, you're no worse off than you are right now. Catherine considered this. The sun was climbing higher, and the heat was becoming oppressive. Every minute she delayed was a minute closer to the dangerous night hours when the temperature would plummet, and predators, both animal and human, would emerge to hunt. She needed help much as her pride rebelled against admitting it. Very well, she said finally, but I'll be watching every move you make, and this gun stays in my hand. Wouldn't expect anything less from Judge Reed's daughter, Jax replied casually as he walked toward the damaged wheel. Catherine's blood ran cold. How do you know who my father is? Jax paused in his examination of the broken wheel and looked up at her with something that might have been regret. Your name, you're bearing the quality of that gun, and your skill with it. Marcus Reed's reputation extends well beyond Boston Miss Reed. He's known as a fair judge, but a hard man, and it's said his daughter inherited both his intelligence and his iron will. That doesn't explain how a cattle rancher in Montana knows the details of my father's reputation. Catherine pressed her finger, tightening slightly on the trigger. I wasn't always a rancher. Jax admitted, his attention seemingly focused on the wheel, but his posture alert. Used to practice law myself back in Austin. Crossed paths with your father's legal work more than once. When I decided to try my hand at ranching, Montana seemed far enough away from courtrooms and legal briefs to suit me. The revelation added another layer to the mystery of Jackson Blackwell. A lawyer turned rancher was unusual enough, but one who'd given up what was presumably a successful practice to work cattle in the wilderness suggested a man running from something or toward something. What made you abandon the law? Catherine asked, her curiosity overriding her caution for a moment. Jax was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested old pain. Sometimes a man realizes that all the legal principles in the world can't protect the people who matter most. Sometimes the law fails, and a man has to decide whether to fail with it or find another way to live. There was a story there, Catherine realized, probably a tragic one. But before she could probe further, Jax straightened up from his examination of the wheel. Good news and bad news, he announced. The good news is this wheel can be fixed. The bad news is it's going to take time and proper tools, neither of which we have out here. Then what do you suggest? Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. My ranch is about 3 hours' ride north of here. I can take you there, we can fix the wheel properly, and I can escort you to Silver Creek tomorrow morning. You'd be there in time for the school board meeting tomorrow evening. The proposal was logical, practical, and absolutely scandalous. An unmarried woman spending the night at a bachelor's ranch was the kind of thing that destroyed reputations and ended careers before they began. Catherine had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to risk everything on the word of a stranger, no matter how compelling he might seem. That's impossible, she said firmly. My reputation will be a lot less important than your life if you're stuck out here when the sun goes down, Jax interrupted gently. Miss Reed, I understand your concerns and I respect them, but this territory is home to wolves, cougars, and men who make both look tame by comparison. A woman alone out here at night. He shook his head grimly. Catherine knew he was right, but knowing it didn't make the choice any easier. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, depended on arriving in Silver Creek with her reputation intact. The school board would never hire a teacher whose moral character was questionable, no matter how qualified she might be. There has to be another way, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I wish there was, Jax replied sincerely. But I won't lie to you about the dangers, and I won't pretend there are choices when there aren't. However, I can give you my word as a gentleman that your virtue and reputation will be as safe at my ranch as they would be in your father's house. The comparison to her father's house struck Catherine as either incredibly naive or surprisingly perceptive. Judge Reed's house was many things, but safe wasn't always one of them. Her father's temper and rigid expectations had made her childhood a minefield of potential explosions where the wrong word or gesture could result in hours of cold silence or blistering lectures about propriety and duty. The word of a gentleman I met an hour ago while he was staring down the barrel of my gun, Catherine observed wryly. The word of a man who could have taken that gun away from you 10 minutes ago if his intentions were dishonorable, Jax replied quietly. Miss Reed, I understand why you don't trust me. In your position, I wouldn't trust me either, but I'm offering you the only viable option you have, and I'm offering it with no conditions except that you accept my help in the spirit it's given. Catherine studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw instead was a kind of weary honesty that spoke to battles fought and losses endured. This was a man who'd learned that words were cheap, but actions had weight. If I agree to this, she said slowly, I want your word that you'll respect the boundaries of proper behavior, and I keep my gun. You have my word, and I wouldn't dream of asking you to give up your gun, Jax replied. A woman should always be able to protect herself, especially in country like this. It was the right answer, delivered without hesitation or qualification. Catherine felt some of her tension ease, though she kept her weapon ready. Very well, Mr. Blackwell, but I want to be very clear about something. I'm not like other women. I don't swoon at the first sign of danger. I don't need protecting from harsh realities, and I won't be grateful for help that comes with expectations attached. Jax's smile was slow and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. Miss Reed, the fact that you're not like other women is exactly why I want to help you. Any woman who can draw down on a stranger and make him believe she'll pull the trigger is exactly the kind of person this territory needs. The word sent an unexpected warmth through Catherine's chest, though she tried to ignore it. Men had praised her before her intelligence, her education, her father's connections, but none had ever seemed to appreciate the very qualities that made other people uncomfortable. Her directness, her refusal to defer to masculine authority, her insistence on being treated as an equal rather than a delicate ornament. These were the traits that had driven away more than one potential suitor back in Boston. You say that now, Catherine replied, holstering her gun but keeping her hand near it. You might feel differently after you've spent more time in my company. I doubt that very much, Jack said as he began gathering her bags. But I suppose we'll find out, won't we? As they prepared to leave the broken coach behind, Catherine felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She was about to place her trust, her safety, and quite possibly her future in the hands of a man she'd met at gunpoint less than an hour ago. It went against every lesson her father had taught her about caution and propriety. But as Jax helped her secure her belongings on his horse and showed her how to ride behind him without compromising her modesty, Catherine realized that perhaps some of her father's lessons had been wrong. Perhaps there were times when caution was less important than courage, and propriety less valuable than survival. The horse, a magnificent bay stallion named Thunder, according to Jack, stood perfectly still as Catherine settled herself behind the saddle. She'd ridden before, of course, but always side saddle on the gentle mares her father kept for ladies. This was different. She could feel the raw power of the animal beneath her, the barely contained energy of a creature bred for speed and endurance rather than decoration. Hold on tight, Jax advised as he swung up into the saddle in front of her. Thunder likes to run, and this country's not forgiving of folks who fall. Catherine wrapped her arms around his waist, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body and the subtle scent of leather horse and something indefinably masculine. It was improper, intimate, and absolutely necessary, and she was surprised to find that she didn't mind it as much as she should have. As they rode north across the endless grassland, Catherine found herself studying the man who'd become her unlikely rescuer. Up close, she could see details that distance had hidden: the calluses on his hands, that spoke of real work, the careful way he scanned the horizon for threats, the unconscious competence with which he handled both horse and rider. Tell me about Silver Creek, she said after they'd ridden in comfortable silence for perhaps an hour. What should I expect? It's a good town, Jax replied, his voice carrying easily over the sound of hoofbeats. Growing fast, which brings both opportunities and problems. The silver mine keeps folks employed, but it also attracts the kind of men who follow easy money. The law's decent Sheriff Morrison's an honest man, if not always the bravest. And the folks who've been there a while are mostly solid citizens trying to build something lasting. And the children I'll be teaching, bright for the most part, eager to learn. They've been without a real teacher for almost a year since Mrs. Henderson passed, so they're a bit wild, but nothing a firm hand can't manage. Catherine smiled at that. A firm hand is something I can provide. My father always said that discipline was the foundation of education. Your father sounds like a man with strong opinions about most things, Jax observed diplomatically. He is, Catherine corrected herself, unsure why she'd used the past tense. He has very definite ideas about how the world should work and how people should behave within it. And do you share those ideas? It was a simple question, but it struck at the heart of everything Catherine had been grappling with since deciding to leave Boston. Did she share her father's rigid views about propriety duty and the proper place of women in society? Or was she striking out for the frontier precisely because she wanted to escape those constraints? Some of them, she said finally. But I've come to believe that the world is more complicated than my father's philosophy allows for. Out here, survival matters more than propriety, and results matter more than method. That's a dangerous way of thinking, Jack said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Folks might start expecting women to use their judgment instead of just following rules. Exactly, Catherine replied, surprising herself with her vehemence. I'm tired of being told what I can and can't do based on the accident of my gender, rather than the content of my character or the quality of my mind. Is that why you came west, to escape expectations? Catherine considered the question as they rode. The honest answer was more complicated than she'd admitted even to herself. Yes, she wanted to escape the suffocating expectations of Boston society, but she also wanted to prove something to herself, to her father, to all the men who'd dismissed her capabilities because she wore skirts instead of trousers. Partly, she admitted. But mostly, I came because I want to make a difference. Back east, I would have spent my life teaching the daughters of wealthy families to speak French and play piano. Here I can teach children who genuinely need education to build better lives. It feels more meaningful. And you're willing to risk everything for that meaning. What's the alternative? A safe, comfortable life where I never challenge myself or accomplish anything significant. That's not living. That's just existing. Jax was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine wondered if she'd revealed too much of herself to this virtual stranger. But when he spoke, his voice held a note of understanding that surprised her. I know something about giving up safety for meaning, he said. It's not an easy choice, but it's the only one that lets you sleep at night knowing you haven't wasted the gifts you were given. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the vast openness of the landscape creating a sense of peace Catherine hadn't felt in months. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber that took her breath away. It was as they crested a low ridge that Catherine saw Jackson Blackwell's ranch spread out in the valley below them, and her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the rough, ramshackle operation she'd expected from a former lawyer-turned-cattleman. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that spoke of comfort and permanence. Outbuildings dotted the property barns, corrals a bunkhouse for hired hands, all built with the same attention to quality and detail. It's beautiful, Catherine said softly, and meant it. It's home, Jax replied simply. Took me 3 years to build it right, but it was worth the effort. As they rode down into the valley, Catherine could see cattle scattered across the grassland, hundreds of them, sleek and well-fed. This was clearly a successful operation, which raised new questions about Jackson Blackwell. Men didn't build spreads like this without substantial capital, careful planning, and years of hard work. What had driven a successful lawyer to give all that up for this demanding but isolated life? The house was even more impressive up close. The stonework was professional quality, and the timber had been carefully selected and fitted. Wide windows caught the afternoon light, and flower boxes beneath them held hardy wildflowers that had somehow survived the brutal summer heat. It was the home of a man who planned to stay, who'd built not just for function, but for beauty. Mr. Blackwell, called a voice from the barn, and Catherine turned to see a grizzled man emerge wiping his hands on a rag. Wasn't expecting you back till tomorrow. Change of plans, Charlie, Jax replied as he helped Catherine down from the horse. This is Miss Catherine Reed. She's bound for Silver Creek, but had some trouble with her coach. Miss Reed, this is Charlie Morse, my foreman, and the man who keeps this place running when I'm fool enough to think I know what I'm doing. Charlie touched his hat politely, but Catherine could see him taking in every detail of her appearance and drawing his own conclusions about what a lady from back east was doing at his boss's ranch. She met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she wasn't ashamed of her circumstances or intimidated by his scrutiny. Pleasure, Miss Ott, Charlie said finally. I'll see to Thunder and get your things. Thank you, Catherine replied with genuine warmth. I appreciate your kindness. As Charlie led the horse away, Jax gestured toward the house. Come on up to the porch where it's cooler. Maria should have supper ready soon, and you can clean up if you'd like. Maria. My housekeeper, Charlie's wife. They've been with me since I started building this place." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "She's also the best cook in 3 counties, and probably the only woman who's not afraid to tell me when I'm being an idiot." The front door opened as they approached, and a small dark-haired woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked to be in her 40s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense bearing of someone accustomed to managing both household and husband with equal efficiency. "Jax, you're early," she said, then stopped short when she saw Catherine. Her eyes took in the traveling dress, the dusty appearance and the wary posture of a woman in unfamiliar territory, and her expression immediately softened with maternal concern. "Maria, this is Miss Catherine Reed," Jack said. "She's the new school teacher for Silver Creek, but her coach broke down on the trail. I offered our hospitality for the night." Maria's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "The school teacher? Oh, this is wonderful. Please come in. You must be exhausted. Charlie told me someone was finally coming to teach the children, but we didn't know when to expect you." The warmth of the welcome caught Catherine off guard. She'd expected suspicion judgment, perhaps barely concealed disapproval of her unusual circumstances. Instead, she found herself being ushered into a home that radiated comfort and genuine hospitality. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior had promised. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable furniture that looked well used but well maintained, and bookshelves that caught Catherine's immediate attention. The books weren't for show, they were clearly read and reread, covering everything from agricultural texts to classic literature to legal treatises that spoke to Jax's former profession. "You have an impressive library," Catherine observed, running her fingers along the spine of a well-worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works. "Books are one of the few things I brought from my old life," Jax replied. "Out here, they're sometimes the only thing standing between a man and complete barbarism." "I'll show you to the guest room," Maria interjected, shooting Jax a look that clearly said he should stop talking and let their guest get settled. "You can wash up and rest before supper. Jax, make yourself useful and help Charlie with Miss Reed's things." The guest room was on the second floor with windows that looked out over the valley and the distant mountains. It was clearly a woman's room, decorated with feminine touches that spoke of careful thought and planning. The bed was covered with a beautiful quilt, and fresh wildflowers sat in a vase on the dresser. "This is lovely," Catherine said sincerely. "But I have to ask, did you prepare this room specifically for female guests?" Maria's smile was knowing. Jax built this house with the hope that someday he'd have a family to fill it. This was meant to be a daughter's room, but since that daughter hasn't appeared yet, it serves nicely for guests. The revelation added another layer to Catherine's understanding of Jackson Blackwell. He'd built a family home in the wilderness, complete with children's rooms and a woman's touch throughout. It suggested a man who'd given up one dream but hadn't abandoned hope for another. "I'll leave you to get settled," Maria continued. "Supper will be ready in about an hour. And Miss Reed, don't let Jax's rough exterior fool you. He's a good man who's had some hard years, but his heart's in the right place." After Maria left, Catherine stood at the window looking out over the ranch and trying to process everything that had happened since her coach wheel had broken that morning. In the space of a few hours, her carefully planned journey had become an adventure that would have been unthinkable back in Boston. She was staying at the home of a bachelor rancher she'd met at gunpoint, trusting her safety and reputation to people she'd known for less than a day. And yet she felt safer here than she had in months. There was something about this place, about these people, that spoke to a deep honesty she hadn't encountered in the drawing rooms and social gatherings of her former life. Here people said what they meant and meant what they said. There were no hidden agendas, no social games designed to trap the unwary. As Catherine washed the dust from her face and hands in the basin Maria had provided, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and was surprised by what she saw. Her cheeks were flushed from sun and wind, her hair had escaped its careful pins, and her eyes held a brightness she hadn't seen there in years. She looked alive in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. Supper was served in a dining room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, with a table large enough for a family but set tonight for 4. Charlie had cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes, transforming from ranch hand to dinner companion with ease. The conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from cattle prices to local politics to the challenges facing the new teacher in Silver Creek. The last teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was a saint, Maria explained as she served what was perhaps the best beef stew Catherine had ever tasted. But she was also 70 years old and not inclined to discipline the Wilder children. Some of those boys have been running free for almost a year now. "I'm not afraid of difficult children," Catherine replied confidently. "In my experience, most behavioral problems stem from boredom or lack of proper challenge. Children need to feel engaged and respected, not just managed." "That's a refreshing attitude," Jax observed. "Most folks around here believe in keeping children quiet and obedient, whether they're learning anything or not." "Quiet and obedient children often grow up to be adults who can't think for themselves," Catherine replied. "I'd rather have a classroom full of questions and energy than a room full of silent sheep." The conversation continued long after the meal was finished, covering topics that would have been considered scandalous in polite Boston society. Catherine found herself discussing politics, philosophy, and social issues with a freedom she'd never experienced. These people treated her as an intellectual equal, expecting her to have opinions and defend them with reason, rather than simply agreeing with whatever the men said. It was after Charlie and Maria had retired for the evening that Catherine found herself alone with Jax on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The air had cooled dramatically with the setting sun, and she was grateful for the shawl Maria had lent her. "I want to thank you," she said quietly, "not just for helping me today, but for treating me like a person rather than a problem to be solved." "What else would I treat you like?" Jax asked, genuinely puzzled. "Most men would have either left me stranded to teach me a lesson about traveling alone, or they would have rescued me in a way that made it clear I owed them something for their gallantry. You offered help without conditions, and accepted my independence without trying to undermine it." Jax was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I learned a long time ago that the strongest people are often the ones who've been forced to stand alone. Trying to weaken someone like that would be like breaking a fine blade just because it's sharp." The metaphor was unexpectedly poetic, and Catherine found herself studying his profile in the starlight. There were depths to Jackson Blackwell that she was only beginning to glimpse, layers of experience and loss that had shaped him into someone far more complex than his rough exterior suggested. "What happened to you?" she asked impulsively. "What made you leave the law and come out here?" For a long time she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the peaceful ranch spread out before them. "I believed in justice," he said simply. "Believed that if you fought hard enough and smart enough, you could protect people from those who would hurt them. I was wrong." "What changed your mind?" Jax's hands gripped the porch railing, and Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. "I had clients, a family who were being threatened by a man with money and political connections. The law said they were in the right, but the law couldn't protect them when it mattered. They died because I believed a piece of paper could stop a bullet." The words hung in the night air like a physical weight. Catherine could hear the guilt and pain in his voice, could understand now why he'd chosen to build a new life, in a place where right and wrong were measured by different standards. "So you came here to escape that failure." "I came here to find a place where a man's actions matter more than his connections, where strength and honesty count for more than clever words and political favors." He turned to look at her directly. "I came here to find a place where I could live with myself." The honesty of the admission took Catherine's breath away. Here was a man who'd lost everything that mattered to him and chosen to rebuild rather than surrender. It was a kind of courage she'd never encountered before. Not the flashy bravery of soldiers or adventurers, but the quiet determination of someone who'd stared into the abyss and decided to create light instead of cursing the darkness. "And have you found that place?" she asked softly. "I'm starting to think I might have," Jax replied, and something in his tone made her pulse quicken. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the night deepened around them. Catherine found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her. The steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the subtle masculine scent that seemed to belong as naturally to the frontier as the sage and wildflowers. When she finally excused herself to retire, Jack stood and offered her his hand to help her up from the porch swing. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, and she was grateful for the darkness that hid her blush. "Good night, Miss Reed," he said formally, but his eyes held a warmth that was anything but distant. Good night, Mr. Blackwell, and thank you again for everything. Thank you for trusting me with your safety. I don't take that responsibility lightly. As Catherine prepared for bed in the beautiful guest room, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the course of a single day. 24 hours ago, she'd been a proper Boston lady, traveling west to take up a respectable teaching position. Tonight, she was staying in the home of a man who challenged every assumption she'd ever made about herself and her place in the world. Tomorrow, she would continue on to Silver Creek and begin the life she'd planned. But tonight, for the first time in years, Catherine Reed felt truly alive. And as she drifted off to sleep in Jackson Blackwell's guest room, she wondered if perhaps some detours were meant to become destinations. Outside her window, the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, vast and wild, and full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. And somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the distant call of wolves singing their ancient songs to the moon, free and fierce and untamed. Just like the woman who lay listening to their voices, Catherine Reed was beginning to understand that some kinds of freedom were worth any risk. Catherine woke to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant lowing of cattle sounds that would have been foreign and alarming just days ago, but now seemed as natural as breathing. Golden sunlight streamed through the guest room windows, painting everything in warm amber tones that made the unfamiliar surroundings feel almost magical. She dressed quickly in her most practical traveling dress, a deep green wool that wouldn't show every speck of trail dust, and made her way downstairs to find the household already bustling with morning activity. Maria was in the kitchen humming softly as she prepared what smelled like the most magnificent breakfast Catherine had ever encountered. The aroma of fresh biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee filled the air, creating an atmosphere of warmth and welcome that was utterly different from the formal, silent breakfasts of her father's house. "Good morning, dear," Maria called cheerfully. "I hope you slept well. The mountain air takes some getting used to, but most folks find it helps them rest better than they have in years." "I slept wonderfully, thank you," Catherine replied, and was surprised to realize it was completely true. Despite being in a strange place under unusual circumstances, she'd slept more peacefully than she had since leaving Boston. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Maria's face lit up with pleasure. "Oh, you don't need to work, dear. You're our guest." "Please," Catherine insisted. "I'd feel much more comfortable if I could be useful. Back home, I often helped in the kitchen when our cook would allow it." "Well, if you insist," Maria said, clearly delighted by Catherine's attitude. "You can help me finish these biscuits. Jax and Charlie will be in from the morning chores soon, and they'll be hungry as bears." Working alongside Maria in the warm kitchen, Catherine found herself relaxing in a way she'd rarely experienced. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple, purposeful work kneading dough, tending the stove, setting the table with care. It was honest labor that produced immediate, tangible results, so different from the ornamental accomplishments that had filled her days in Boston. "You have a real gift for this," Maria observed as Catherine expertly flipped bacon in the iron skillet. "Most ladies from back east wouldn't know one end of a spatula from the other." "My father's cook was very patient with a curious little girl," Catherine explained. "She taught me that knowing how to prepare food was a practical skill every woman should possess regardless of her station in life." A wise woman. Too many folks think they're above honest work, but there's dignity in feeding people well. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on the porch, followed by male voices discussing the day's work. Catherine felt her pulse quicken at the sound of Jax's deep drawl, and she was annoyed with herself for the reaction. She was a sensible woman with important goals, not some romantic fool who lost her composure over a handsome face and kind treatment. "Morning, ladies," Jax said as he entered the kitchen, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Something smells incredible in here." He'd already been working for hours, Catherine realized, taking in his slightly dusty clothes and the satisfied tiredness in his eyes. While she'd been sleeping peacefully in his guest room, he'd been out tending his cattle and managing the 100 daily tasks that kept a ranch running. It was a sobering reminder that this wasn't a social visit. She was disrupting his routine and imposing on his generosity. "Miss Reed helped with breakfast," Maria announced proudly. "She's got real kitchen skills, this one." "I'm not surprised," Jax replied, his eyes meeting Catherine's with a warmth that made her stomach flutter unaccountably. A woman who can handle a gun and fix a wheel can probably manage most anything she sets her mind to. About that wheel, Catherine said, grateful for a practical topic to focus on. Will we be able to repair it this morning? Already fixed, Charlie announced as he entered the kitchen, washing his hands at the basin. Took it down to the forge first thing and welded her back together good as new. Might even be stronger than it was originally. Catherine stared at him in amazement. You fixed it already, but it was completely split through. Charlie's the best blacksmith in 3 counties, Jax explained with obvious pride in his foreman. Used to shoe horses for the cavalry before he came west. There's not much he can't fix given proper tools and time. I don't know how to thank you, Catherine said, meaning every word. Both of you. You've saved my position, possibly my entire future. No thanks needed, Charlie said gruffly, but she could see he was pleased by her gratitude. Just glad we could help. As they gathered around the breakfast table, Catherine was struck by how natural this felt, sharing a meal with people who worked hard and treated each other with genuine respect and affection. There were no elaborate social rituals, no careful navigation of class distinctions or hidden agendas, just honest people breaking bread together and planning their day. So what's your plan for Silver Creek? Jax asked as he passed her the platter of biscuits. I mean, beyond just teaching the children. It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Everyone had simply assumed her goal was to teach until she found a suitable husband, then retire to domestic life. The idea that she might have larger ambitions had never occurred to her father or any of his associates. I want to build a real school, Catherine said, surprised by her own boldness. Not just a one-room building where children recite lessons by rote, but a place where they can learn to think critically, to question, to dream about possibilities beyond what their parents achieved. That's ambitious, Maria observed, and probably controversial. Not everyone believes in encouraging children to think beyond their station. Then not everyone understands what education is really for, Catherine replied firmly. Knowledge isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about developing the tools to solve problems, to adapt to change, to build something better than what came before. Jax leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You know you're going to face resistance. There are folks in Silver Creek who believe education should prepare children for the lives they're expected to lead, not fill their heads with ideas above their station. Let them resist, Catherine said, her chin lifting defiantly. I didn't come all this way to perpetuate the same tired thinking that keeps people trapped in ignorance. If they wanted a teacher who would simply maintain the status quo, they should have hired someone else. And if they decide you're too radical for their taste, Charlie asked gently, what then? Catherine considered the question seriously. She'd been so focused on reaching Silver Creek and beginning her new life that she hadn't fully considered what would happen if her vision conflicted with the community's expectations. Then I suppose I'll have to prove that my methods work, she said finally. Show them that children who are challenged and respected become more capable, not less controllable. That could take time, Jax pointed out. And in the meantime, you'll need allies, people who understand what you're trying to accomplish and are willing to support you when others complain. Are you offering to be one of those allies, Mr. Blackwell? Catherine asked, only half joking. I'm offering to help however I can, he replied seriously. This territory needs people with vision and courage. It needs people who aren't afraid to challenge the way things have always been done. The sincerity in his voice caught Catherine off guard. Here was a man who barely knew her offering support for goals that would likely be controversial and difficult to achieve. It was more encouragement than she'd received from her own father, who'd viewed her teaching plans as a temporary diversion before marriage and motherhood. Why? She asked softly. Why would you support a stranger's ambitions? Jax was quiet for a moment, his coffee cup cradled in his hands as he seemed to consider his answer carefully. Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent and let fear make their decisions for them. Because I believe the future belongs to folks who are brave enough to fight for something better. There was pain behind those words. Catherine realized the same pain she'd heard in his voice the night before when he'd spoken about losing his clients. This was a man who'd learned hard lessons about the cost of inaction, who'd chosen to rebuild his life around different principles. Besides, Maria added with a knowing smile, Jax has always had a soft spot for people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right. It's one of his better qualities. One of my more dangerous qualities, according to some folks, Jax replied wryly. Dangerous how? Catherine asked, intrigued. People who challenge the established order make certain folks nervous, Charlie explained. There's always someone who profits from keeping things the way they are, and they don't take kindly to change. Is that something I should be concerned about in Silver Creek? Most of the trouble comes from outside town, Jax said carefully. Drifters claim jumpers men who see opportunity in chaos. The local folks are generally decent, even if they don't always agree with each other. But there are exceptions, Catherine pressed, sensing there was more to the story. Jax and Charlie exchanged a look that spoke of shared knowledge and mutual concern. It was Maria who finally answered. There's a man named Reeves, she said reluctantly. Marcus Reeves. He runs with a gang of cutthroats and thieves, preys on travelers and isolated homesteads. He's been quiet lately, but that usually means he's planning something bigger. The law doesn't handle men like Reeves, Catherine asked. The law does what it can, Jax replied diplomatically. But this is a big territory with limited resources. Sometimes folks have to handle their own problems. The conversation had taken a sobering turn, reminding Catherine that the frontier's freedom came with very real dangers. She'd known intellectually that she was entering a world where violence was sometimes necessary for survival, but hearing it discussed so matter-of-factly brought the reality home in a way that was both frightening and oddly exhilarating. I'm not afraid, she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. I mean, I'm not naive about the dangers, but I'm not going to let fear keep me from living the life I want. Good, Jax said simply. Fear's a tool for survival, not a philosophy for living. After breakfast, they prepared for the journey to Silver Creek. Catherine's repaired coach looked almost new, the wheel Charlie had mended, showing no signs of the damage that had stranded her. Her belongings were loaded with care, and Maria pressed a basket of food into her hands, despite Catherine's protests. It's a long day's travel, Maria insisted, and you never know what you might encounter on the road. Thank you for everything, Catherine said, embracing the older woman warmly. Your kindness has meant more to me than you know. You're welcome here any time, dear, Maria replied. Don't let the isolation get to you. Come visit whenever you need reminding that you have friends in this territory. Charlie had hitched his own horse to Catherine's coach and would drive her to Silver Creek with Jax riding alongside as escort. It was more protection than strictly necessary for the relatively safe route, but Catherine found herself grateful for their caution. More than that, she was reluctant to say goodbye to the man who'd shown her such unexpected kindness. Ready, Miss Reed? Jax asked, swinging up into his saddle with easy grace. As ready as I'll ever be, Catherine replied, settling herself in the coach with her basket and her thoughts. The journey to Silver Creek took them through some of the most beautiful country Catherine had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched toward distant mountains that rose like purple sentinels against the endless sky. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in brilliant splashes of color. Red Indian paintbrush, yellow sunflowers, delicate blue lupines that seemed to dance in the breeze. It's magnificent, Catherine called to Jax, who was riding close enough to the coach for easy conversation. Wait until you see it in spring, he replied. When the snow melts and everything turns green, it's like watching the world being born all over again. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and share Maria's excellent lunch beside a clear stream that bubbled down from the high country. Catherine found herself studying Jax as he tended to the animals, noting the easy competence with which he handled every task. Here was a man completely comfortable in his chosen world, adapted to its demands in a way that spoke of both natural ability and hard-won experience. You love this life, she observed as they sat beside the stream, sharing bread and cheese in the dappled shade of cottonwood trees. I do, Jax admitted. It's hard sometimes, dangerous, often lonely, but it's honest. Out here you succeed or fail based on your own efforts, your own choices. There's something clean about that. Don't you miss intellectual stimulation, the company of educated people? I miss some things about my old life, he said thoughtfully. Good books are harder to come by, and philosophical discussions are rare, but I found that working with your hands, solving practical problems, building something lasting, There's a different kind of satisfaction in that. Catherine nodded, understanding more than she might have just days before. Her brief experience helping Maria in the kitchen had given her a taste of that satisfaction, the pleasure of creating something useful and immediately beneficial. "What about you?" Jax asked. "What will you miss about Boston?" "Less than I expected," Catherine replied honestly. "The libraries, certainly. The concerts and lectures. But not the social expectations, the constant judgment, the feeling that every word and action was being evaluated for propriety rather than substance. You think Silver Creek will be different?" "I hope so. Frontier communities can't afford to waste talent based on arbitrary social rules. They need everyone to contribute according to their abilities." "That's true to a point," Jack said carefully. "But people bring their prejudices with them even to new places. Don't expect everything to be perfect just because you're west of the Mississippi." It was good advice, Catherine realized, and probably necessary. She'd been so focused on escaping the constraints of her old life that she might have romanticized the freedom of her new one. The frontier would have its own challenges, its own limitations. The key was finding ways to work within those constraints while slowly expanding the boundaries of what was possible. They reached Silver Creek in the late afternoon as the sun was casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Catherine's first impression was of a town in transition, part established community, part rough frontier settlement. Solid brick buildings stood next to ramshackle wooden structures, and the people on the street ranged from well-dressed merchants to rough-looking miners still covered in dust from their shift. The Silver Creek Hotel was a substantial two-story building that looked both respectable and welcoming. Catherine had reserved a room there by telegraph from Denver, and she was relieved to see that it appeared clean and well-maintained. Her reputation would depend partly on where she stayed and how she conducted herself in those first crucial days. "The hotel looks adequate," she observed as Charlie pulled the coach to a stop in front of the building. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment," Jax confirmed. "She's fair but strict about behavior, which should work in your favor." As they unloaded Catherine's belongings, a small crowd began to gather. Word of the new schoolteacher's arrival had clearly spread, and curious faces peered from doorways and windows. Catherine felt the weight of their scrutiny, but kept her posture straight and her expression pleasantly neutral. First impressions would matter enormously in a community this size. "Miss Reed." A distinguished-looking man in his 50s approached, removing his hat politely. "I'm Thomas Morrison, president of the school board. We've been eagerly awaiting your arrival." "Mr. Morrison," Catherine replied, extending her hand with just the right degree of formality. "I'm pleased to be here at last. I apologize for arriving later than expected. I encountered some difficulties on the road." "Nothing serious, I hope." Morrison's eyes flicked briefly to Jax, who was supervising the unloading of Catherine's trunk. "A broken wheel, nothing more. Mr. Blackwell and his people were kind enough to assist with repairs." "Ah, yes, Jax Blackwell. Good man, solid citizen." Morrison's tone suggested approval, but also a certain reserve, as if he wasn't entirely sure what to make of the rancher's involvement in the new teacher's arrival. "Miss Reed," Jack said, approaching with his hat in his hands. "I'll be heading back to the ranch now. Remember what I said about allies? Don't be afraid to call on friends when you need them." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, for everything." Catherine found herself reluctant to see him go, though she couldn't quite say why. "Please give my regards to Maria and Charlie." "I will. Good luck with the children." He touched his hat brim and swung back into his saddle, but his eyes lingered on her face for just a moment longer than propriety dictated. As Jax rode away, Catherine turned her attention to Mr. Morrison and the small group of townspeople who'd gathered to meet her. She could feel their curiosity, their hope, and perhaps a touch of skepticism. These people had been without a teacher for months. They wanted her to succeed, but they'd also learned not to expect too much. "Would you like to see the schoolhouse now, or would you prefer to settle in first?" Morrison asked. "I'd very much like to see the school," Catherine replied immediately. "I'm eager to understand what I'll be working with." The schoolhouse was a short walk from the hotel, and Catherine was pleasantly surprised by what she found. It was a simple but solid structure, larger than she'd expected, with good windows for natural light and a substantial blackboard across the front wall. The desks were worn but serviceable, and there was a small library corner with perhaps 30 books, not extensive but a start. "It's wonderful," Catherine said sincerely, running her hand over one of the desktops. How many students should I expect? 23 registered, Morrison replied. Ages 6 to 15. Some of the older boys work in the mine during busy periods, so attendance can be irregular. And what curriculum have you been following? Morrison looked slightly uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson was traditional in her methods. Reading, writing, arithmetic, Bible verses. She believed in discipline and repetition. Catherine nodded diplomatically. She could already see the challenges she'd face students who'd been taught to memorize rather than think, parents who equated education with conformity, a community that might resist new methods simply because they were unfamiliar. I'd like to meet with parents before classes begin, she said. It's important that they understand my teaching philosophy and feel comfortable with my methods. That can be arranged, Morrison agreed. In fact, we've planned a welcome dinner tomorrow evening. Most of the families will be there along with other community leaders. Perfect, Catherine thought. An opportunity to make her case before opposition could organize. She'd need to be diplomatic, but clear about her intentions, firm, but not confrontational. I look forward to it, she said warmly. In the meantime, I'd like to spend some time here getting familiar with the space and planning my first lessons. After Morrison and the others left, Catherine found herself alone in the schoolhouse as evening shadows lengthened across the wooden floor. She stood at the front of the classroom, looking out at the empty desks and imagining them filled with eager young faces. This was what she'd come west for, the chance to make a real difference in young lives, to plant seeds of curiosity and critical thinking that might bloom for generations. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted her reverie. Catherine turned toward the door, expecting to see Morrison returning with some forgotten instruction. Instead, a stranger stepped into the schoolhouse, a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a predatory smile that made her skin crawl. "So you're the new teacher," he said, his voice carrying a tone that was somehow both casual and threatening. "Marcus Reeves is the name. I like to make the acquaintance of all the pretty new arrivals in town." Catherine's hand moved instinctively toward where her father's gun rested beneath her skirt. Everything about this man screamed danger, from his worn gun belt to the calculating way his eyes assessed her, as if she were merchandise to be evaluated. "Mr. Reeves," she said coolly, keeping her voice steady, despite the fear that was building in her chest. "I'm afraid we haven't been properly introduced. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Morrison if you have questions about the school." Reeves laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Oh, I think you and I can get acquainted just fine without old Morrison's help. You see, Miss Reed, I make it my business to know everyone who might be influential in Silver Creek. Teachers, especially pretty young teachers, can have a lot of sway over folks' thinking." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Catherine replied, though she was beginning to understand exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. This was the predator Maria had warned her about, the threat that lurked on the edges of civilization. "What I mean," Reeves said, stepping closer, "is that smart women like you sometimes get ideas about changing things, stirring up trouble where none needs to exist. And that can be problematic for men like me who prefer the current arrangements." Catherine felt her temper flare despite her fear. "Mr. Reeves, I'm here to teach children, nothing more. If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine why education makes you so uncomfortable." The words were out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted the confrontational tone. Reeves's expression darkened, and she saw his hand drift toward his gun. "Careful school, marm," he said softly. "Brave words can get a person in trouble out here, especially a person who doesn't have many friends to watch her back." "She has more friends than you might think, Reeves." The voice came from the doorway, and Catherine nearly sobbed with relief when she saw Jax step into the schoolhouse. He moved with deceptive casualness, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful positioning that put him between her and Reeves. "Blackwell?" Reeves said, his tone shifting to something that might have been respect or might have been wariness. "Didn't expect to see you in town this evening. Decided to check on Miss Reed settling in," Jax replied easily. "Make sure she has everything she needs. You know how it is, neighbors helping neighbors." "Of course." Reeves smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly myself," welcoming the new teacher to our little community. And now you have, Jack said pointedly. I'm sure Miss Reed appreciates the gesture. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other, and Catherine could feel the weight of unspoken threats and past conflicts. Then Reeves touched his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. Welcome to Silver Creek, Miss Reed, he said. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. After Reeves left, Catherine sank into one of the student desks, her legs suddenly unsteady. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not just because of the implied threat, but because of what it suggested about the challenges she'd face in Silver Creek. Are you all right? Jax asked gently, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by genuine concern. I'm fine, Catherine said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. That was him, wasn't it? The man Maria warned me about. That was him, and now he knows you're here, knows you're not easily intimidated. Jack sat on the edge of the teacher's desk, his expression serious. Catherine, I need you to understand something. Men like Reeves prey on isolation, on fear. They count on people being too afraid to stand up to them. So what are you saying that I should leave? Find somewhere safer? I'm saying you need to be smart. Careful. Don't travel alone if you can help it, especially outside of town. And don't let pride keep you from asking for help when you need it. Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A protectiveness that went beyond neighborly concern, an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the fear still coursing through her system. Why do you care what happens to me? She asked softly. You barely know me. Jax was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the empty classroom and back again. When he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. Because you're not like other women, Catherine. You're brave enough to stand up for what you believe in, strong enough to fight for something better. This territory needs people like you, hell. The world needs people like you. And I'll be damned if I let a piece of garbage like Reeves drive you away before you've had a chance to show what you can do. The words hit Catherine like a physical force carrying an intensity of feeling that took her breath away. No one had ever spoken about her with such conviction, such unwavering belief in her worth and potential. It was everything she'd dreamed of hearing and everything that terrified her about opening her heart to possibilities she'd never dared imagine. That's why I want you to succeed, Jax continued, stepping closer. That's why I want to help however I can. Because watching you walk away from this would be like watching the sun go out. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from gratitude, fear, or something else entirely, she couldn't say. Here in this simple schoolhouse, facing an uncertain future filled with both promise and peril, she'd found something she'd never expected to find: a man who saw her strength as a gift rather than a threat, who wanted to protect her dreams rather than redirect them toward his own purposes. Jax, she whispered, but he stepped back before she could continue, his expression shifting back to something safer, more controlled. I should get you back to the hotel, he said. It's getting dark and you need your rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. As they walked back through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Catherine found herself studying the town with new eyes. These would be her people now, her community to serve and protect. And somewhere in the shadows lurked men like Reeves' threats that would test her resolve and her courage in ways she'd never imagined. But walking beside Jax through the gathering dusk, feeling the strength of his presence and the warmth of his unexpected support, Catherine Reed felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She'd come west to find herself to build something meaningful with her life. What she hadn't expected was to find someone who believed in her vision strongly enough to stand with her against whatever darkness might try to extinguish it. The future stretched ahead like the endless Montana sky, vast, uncertain, and filled with possibilities she was only beginning to glimpse. The hotel room was modest but clean, with a window that overlooked Silver Creek's main street and offered a view of the mountains beyond. Catherine sat on the narrow bed, still shaken from her encounter with Reeves, and tried to process everything that had happened since her arrival. The welcome dinner tomorrow evening would be her first real test, her chance to win over the parents and community leaders who would determine whether her ambitious plans for the school could succeed. She unpacked her few belongings, carefully hanging her best dress for tomorrow's dinner and arranging her teaching materials on the small desk by the window. Her father's books. Shakespeare, Emerson. A collection of scientific papers seemed almost defiant in their sophistication, a declaration that she intended to bring more than basic literacy to Silver Creek's children. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Catherine opened it to find Mrs. Patterson, the hotel proprietress, holding a tea tray. "Thought you might like something warm before bed," the older woman said kindly. "First days in a new place can be unsettling." "That's very thoughtful, thank you." Catherine accepted the tray gratefully, noting the good china and the small plate of cookies that accompanied the tea. "I hear you had a run-in with Marcus Reeves this evening," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble, settling herself in the room's single chair. "Word travels fast in a town this size." Catherine was startled by the directness, but also oddly relieved. If people already knew about the encounter, she wouldn't have to pretend it hadn't happened. "Mr. Reeves introduced himself at the schoolhouse," she said carefully. "He seemed interested in my teaching plans." Mrs. Patterson snorted inelegantly. "Reeves is interested in anything that might interfere with his business, which is separating honest folks from their money through intimidation and worse. The fact that Jax Blackwell was there to see him off is probably the only reason you're sitting here having tea instead of—" She trailed off, but the implication was clear. "Is Mr. Blackwell often involved in confrontations with men like Reeves?" "Jax doesn't go looking for trouble, but he doesn't back down from it either. He's got a reputation for standing up for folks who can't stand up for themselves. Some people think he's too quick to get involved in other people's problems." "And what do you think?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "I think this territory would be a lot worse off without men like Jax Blackwell. He's got principles, and he's willing to pay the price for them. That's rarer than you might think." The conversation stayed with Catherine long after Mrs. Patterson had gone. As she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about Jax's words at the schoolhouse, the intensity in his voice when he'd spoken about her strength and purpose. No man had ever looked at her the way he had, as if she were something precious and powerful at the same time. Sleep came fitfully filled with dreams of dark-eyed strangers and endless prairies of children's faces turned toward her with hope and expectation. She woke before dawn, alert and restless, and decided to use the early morning hours to explore Silver Creek before the town came fully to life. The streets were quiet except for a few early risers tending to morning chores. Catherine walked slowly, taking in details she'd missed the day before. The town was clearly prosperous. The silver mine provided steady employment, and the businesses along Main Street looked established and well-maintained. But there were signs of the rough edges that came with frontier-life saloons with boarded windows from recent fights wanted posters on the sheriff's office wall, the general store's advertisements for guns and ammunition, alongside notices for school supplies and ladies' dry goods. The schoolhouse looked different in the morning light, smaller perhaps, but also more welcoming. Catherine used her key to enter and spent an hour arranging the classroom moving desks into a more collaborative arrangement and placing the few books where students could easily see them. She was writing the day's lesson plan on the blackboard when she heard voices approaching. "I tell you, Morrison, we should have interviewed her more carefully before offering the position." Catherine recognized the voice of Henry Walsh, one of the school board members she'd been introduced to the previous evening. She moved closer to the window to listen, knowing it was improper, but needing to understand what she was facing. "The woman arrives in town with Jax Blackwell as her escort, spends her first evening getting into confrontations with dangerous men, and you think that's the kind of influence we want around our children," Walsh continued. "Now hold on, Henry," came Morrison's calmer voice. "Miss Reed didn't seek out trouble with Reeves, he came to her. And as for Blackwell, the man was being neighborly. You can't fault someone for accepting help when they need it." "Can't I? What do we really know about this woman?" "She's unmarried, traveling alone, clearly has ideas above her station. Mark my words, she'll fill our children's heads with notions that'll make them dissatisfied with honest work." Catherine felt her temper rise, but forced herself to remain quiet. This was valuable intelligence about the opposition she'd face, even if it stung to hear her character questioned by men who'd never spoken to her for more than 5 minutes. "Miss Reed comes with excellent references," Morrison replied firmly. "Judge Reed's recommendation alone should be sufficient, and her credentials are impeccable. We've been without a teacher for months, Henry. We can't afford to be overly particular." "We can't afford to hire someone who'll cause more problems than she solves," Walsh shot back. "I'm telling you, Thomas, that woman is going to be trouble. Catherine waited until their voices faded before emerging from the schoolhouse, her jaw set with determination. If Henry Walsh wanted to see trouble, she'd show him what a truly troublesome woman could accomplish. But first she needed to win over enough allies to counter his influence. The rest of the morning was spent visiting local businesses and introducing herself to potential supporters. At the general store, she met Mrs. Sarah Chen, whose family had immigrated from China to work on the railroad before settling in Silver Creek. Mrs. Chen's English was accented but clear, and her eyes lit up when Catherine mentioned her plans to include geography and science in the curriculum. "My Tommy, he is so smart," Mrs. Chen said proudly. "But previous teachers, she say, he asks too many questions. I tell her questions are good, they show thinking mind." "I couldn't agree more," Catherine replied warmly. "A curious child is a gift, not a problem. Tommy sounds like exactly the kind of student I'm hoping to work with." At the bakery, she encountered a different perspective from Mrs. Gladys Murphy, whose Irish accent was still thick despite 20 years in America. "'Tis all well and good to talk about fancy teaching methods," Mrs. Murphy said skeptically, as she kneaded bread dough. "But what my Sean needs is to learn his letters and numbers well enough to keep accounts and write a proper business letter. All this talk about thinking and questioning, where does that get a working man?" "It gets him the ability to solve problems he's never encountered before," Catherine replied respectfully. "To adapt when circumstances change, to recognize opportunities others might miss. Sean may start as a working man, but he doesn't have to end there if he has the tools to build something better." Mrs. Murphy paused in her kneading, considering this. "You really think my Sean could be more than a baker or a miner?" "I think Sean could be anything he sets his mind to if he's given the chance to discover what that might be." By lunchtime, Catherine had visited a dozen businesses and spoken with twice as many parents. The reactions were mixed, some enthusiastic, some skeptical, some openly hostile. But she'd also begun to identify potential allies and understand the community's dynamics. The newer residents, particularly those from immigrant families, seemed more open to innovative teaching methods. The established families, especially those with mining or ranching interests, appeared more conservative and traditional in their educational expectations. She was walking back toward the hotel when she spotted Jax's horse tied outside the sheriff's office. Curious despite herself, Catherine lingered near the general store, pretending to examine the window display while keeping an eye on the building across the street. When Jax emerged, he was accompanied by a tall, spare man wearing a sheriff's badge. The two men stood talking in low voices for several minutes, their expressions serious. Catherine caught only fragments of their conversation, but what she heard made her blood run cold. 3 homesteads hit last month. Getting bold, won't be long before he tries something in town. They were talking about Reeves, Catherine realized. The outlaw was escalating his activities, and both Jax and the sheriff were clearly concerned about what that might mean for Silver Creek's safety. The sheriff noticed her watching and touched his hat politely. "Miss Reed, isn't it Bob Morrison, town sheriff? Welcome to Silver Creek." "Thank you, Sheriff Morrison. I hope I haven't interrupted anything important." "Just discussing some security concerns," Morrison replied diplomatically. "Nothing for you to worry about, but it's always wise to take reasonable precautions. I understand you'll be walking to and from the schoolhouse daily." "That's right." "Might be best to vary your route, avoid traveling alone after dark. Standard precautions for anyone in these parts." Catherine nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Reeves' interest in her had elevated her from ordinary citizen to potential target. The thought was sobering, but also strangely liberating. If she was going to be in danger anyway, she might as well make it worthwhile by pushing for real change in the school. "I'll be careful, Sheriff. Thank you for the advice." After Morrison headed back inside, Jax approached Catherine with a concerned expression. "You heard some of that conversation," he said, without preamble. "Enough to understand that Mr. Reeves is becoming a more serious problem." "He is, and your arrival seems to have caught his attention in a way that could be dangerous." Jax's voice was grim. "Catherine, I want you to consider postponing your more ambitious plans for the school, at least until we can deal with the Reeves situation." Catherine felt her spine stiffen. "Are you suggesting I compromise my principles because a criminal finds them threatening?" "I'm suggesting you stay alive long enough to implement those principles," Jax replied sharply. "Dead martyrs don't teach children, Catherine. Neither do cowards, she shot back, then immediately regretted the harshness of her words. I'm sorry that was unfair. I know you're trying to protect me, but I won't be intimidated into mediocrity, Jax. If I wanted to play it safe, I would have stayed in Boston. Jax studied her face for a long moment, and Catherine saw frustration, admiration, and something deeper warring in his expression. You're right, he said finally. It was unfair of me to ask you to be less than you are, but promise me you'll be smart about it. Don't take unnecessary risks just to prove a point. I promise to be as careful as circumstances allow, Catherine replied, which they both knew wasn't quite the same thing. The afternoon was spent preparing for the evening's dinner, both physically and mentally. Catherine chose her clothing carefully. Her best dress was elegant but not ostentatious, fashionable but not frivolous. She needed to project competence and respectability, while also suggesting that she brought something special to Silver Creek. The dinner was held at the town hall, a substantial building that doubled as a meeting place and social center. Catherine arrived precisely on time, knowing that being either early or late would be noted and potentially criticized. The hall was decorated with autumn flowers and filled with the appetizing aromas of a proper community feast. Nearly 50 people had gathered: parents, school board members, business owners, and other community leaders. Catherine recognized many faces from her morning visits, but there were others she hadn't met, people whose children she'd be teaching and whose support she'd need to earn. Thomas Morrison stepped forward to make the introductions, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to present Miss Catherine Reed, our new school teacher. Miss Reed comes to us with impressive credentials and excellent recommendations. I know you're all eager to hear about her plans for our children's education. The applause was polite but measured, and Catherine could feel the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes evaluating every detail of her appearance and demeanor. This was her moment, her chance to win over the community or alienate them permanently. Thank you, Mr. Morrison, and thank you all for this warm welcome. Catherine began, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. I want to start by saying how honored I am to be here and how impressed I've been by Silver Creek's commitment to education. Building a proper school in a frontier community takes vision and sacrifice, and you should all be proud of what you've accomplished. Nods and smiles around the room suggested this opening had struck the right note. Catherine pressed forward. I also want to be honest with you about my teaching philosophy, because I believe parents have a right to know what their children will be learning and why. Education, in my view, is not just about memorizing facts or following rules. It's about developing the ability to think critically, to solve problems, to adapt to change. She paused, scanning the room for reactions. Some faces showed interest, others skepticism, but she had their attention. I plan to teach your children not just to read, but to understand what they read, not just to calculate, but to apply mathematics to real problems they might face, not just to recite history, but to learn from it. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, passion overriding nervousness. I want to prepare them not just for the jobs that exist today, but for opportunities that don't even exist yet. Henry Walsh stood up from his seat near the front, his expression stern. Miss Reed, that all sounds very grand, but some of us are concerned about filling children's heads with ideas above their station. Most of these youngsters will grow up to be miners, ranchers, shopkeepers. They need practical skills, not fancy theories. Catherine had expected this challenge and was ready for it. Mr. Walsh, I couldn't agree more that children need practical skills. But I'd argue that the ability to think clearly and adapt to new situations is the most practical skill of all. The child who learns only to follow instructions will struggle when circumstances change. The child who learns to analyze problems and develop solutions will thrive no matter what challenges they face. But surely you're not suggesting our children shouldn't be satisfied with honest work. This came from a woman. Catherine didn't recognize her tone, carrying a note of suspicion. I'm suggesting that every child deserves the chance to discover their full potential, Catherine replied firmly. Whether that leads them to mining, ranching, teaching, or building businesses we haven't imagined yet. My job isn't to limit their dreams, it's to give them the tools to achieve whatever they're capable of achieving. Mrs. Chen stood up from the back of the room, her voice clear despite her accent. My Tommy, he wants to be engineer like men who build railroad. Previous teachers say this impossible for Chinese boy. Miss Reed, you think my Tommy can learn engineering? Catherine smiled warmly at the woman. Mrs. Chen, if Tommy has the aptitude and determination for engineering, then yes, I believe he can learn whatever he needs to learn. Intelligence and curiosity don't depend on where your grandparents were born. A murmur ran through the room, some approving, some uncomfortable. Catherine could see she was walking a fine line between inspiring hope and challenging too many assumptions at once. "What about discipline?" called out Mrs. Murphy from the middle of the room. "Children need structure rules. They need to learn respect for authority." "Absolutely," Catherine agreed. "But there's a difference between mindless obedience and genuine respect. I want to earn your children's respect by challenging them, by showing them that learning can be exciting and relevant to their lives. A classroom based on mutual respect and intellectual engagement will have better discipline than one based on fear and boredom." The questions continued for another hour, covering everything from specific curriculum plans to concerns about moral instruction. Catherine answered as honestly as she could, while trying to reassure parents that their values would be respected even as their children's horizons expanded. It was near the end of the evening when Marcus Reeves made his appearance. Catherine didn't see him enter. She was engaged in conversation with a group of mothers about reading materials, but she felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Conversations became more guarded, voices dropped, and several people moved almost unconsciously away from the entrance. "Well, well," came Reeves' voice from behind her, and Catherine turned to face him with what she hoped was calm composure. The famous schoolmarm holding court with the good citizens of Silver Creek. "Mr. Reeves," she replied evenly, "how nice of you to join us. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Always interesting to hear about new ideas coming to our little community." His smile was predatory, but his voice was pleasant enough that anyone not watching closely might miss the menace underneath. Thomas Morrison stepped forward, his expression diplomatically neutral. "Marcus, good to see you. Miss Reed was just explaining her teaching methods to some of the parents." "Oh, I'm sure she was," Reeves said, his eyes never leaving Catherine's face. "Tell me, Miss Reed, do your teaching methods include lessons about knowing one's place, about understanding when it's wise to avoid complications?" The threat was barely veiled, but delivered in such a casual tone that Catherine couldn't respond directly without seeming to overreact. She felt trapped between appearing weak or creating a scene that would damage her standing with the community. "I believe in teaching children to think for themselves and make informed decisions," she replied carefully, "whether that's about mathematics, literature, or any other subject." "Admirable," Reeves said, stepping closer. "Though sometimes thinking too much can lead to poor decisions. I'd hate to see someone as educated as yourself make choices that might have unintended consequences." The room had gone nearly silent, everyone aware that they were witnessing something significant, but not entirely sure what. Catherine felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her reaction, knowing that how she handled this moment would define her relationship with the community going forward. Before she could respond, she heard the distinctive sound of spurs on wooden floors, and the crowd parted to admit Jax Blackwell. He moved with deliberate calm, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he positioned himself between her and Reeves. "Marcus," Jax said pleasantly, "surprised to see you at a school function. Don't recall you having any children in need of education." "Just taking an interest in community affairs," Reeves replied, his tone remaining light despite the obvious challenge. "Important to stay informed about new developments." "Indeed it is," Jax agreed. "Speaking of which, I heard the territorial marshal is taking a renewed interest in certain business activities in this area. Always good to stay informed about those kinds of developments, too." The exchange was subtle, but unmistakable. Reeves's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Catherine realized she was witnessing a careful dance of threats and counter-threats played out in language civilized enough for public consumption, but deadly serious underneath. "Gentlemen," Thomas Morrison interrupted smoothly, "perhaps we could save the business discussions for another time. This is Miss Reed's welcome dinner after all." "Of course," Reeves said, touching his hat brim in a mockery of courtesy. "Miss Reed, I look forward to seeing how your educational experiment develops. I'm sure it will be very enlightening for everyone involved." With that, he turned and left as suddenly as he'd arrived, leaving behind a room full of uncomfortable silence and worried glances. Jax remained where he was for a moment, his presence a reassuring anchor in the aftermath of the confrontation. When he finally moved, it was to approach Catherine with concerned eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," Catherine replied, though her hands were trembling slightly. "Thank you for whatever that was." "Just neighbors looking out for each other," Jax said with a slight smile, "though I suspect Mr. Reeves got the message he needed to get." The dinner began to break up after that, with parents and community members approaching Catherine individually to express support or ask final questions. The reactions were mixed. Some people seemed energized by her vision for the school, while others appeared worried about the attention her methods might attract from dangerous elements. Mrs. Chen was among the last to leave, grasping Catherine's hands warmly. "You are a brave woman," she said simply. "My Tommy, he will learn much from you, not just book's courage, too." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That means more to me than you know." As the hall emptied, Catherine found herself alone with Jax, helping to clear the last of the dishes and blow out the candles. "How do you think it went?" she asked as they worked side by side in the comfortable quiet. "Better than it could have," Jax replied honestly. "You made some friends tonight, and you showed people that you won't be easily intimidated. That counts for a lot in a place like this. But I also painted a target on my back, didn't I? By standing up to Reeves in front of the whole community." Jax stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully. "Catherine, you had a target on your back the moment you decided to come west and challenge the way things have always been done. Reeves isn't afraid of you because you're a woman traveling alone. He's afraid of you because you represent change, progress, the possibility that people might start expecting more from their lives. Is that supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be honest. You can't fight for something better without making enemies of the people who profit from keeping things worse." Catherine nodded slowly, understanding the truth of his words, even if she didn't particularly like their implications. "Walk me back to the hotel," she asked as they finished cleaning up. "Of course." The night air was crisp and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Their footsteps echoed softly on the wooden sidewalks as they made their way through the quiet streets of Silver Creek. "Jax," Catherine said as they reached the hotel steps. "Can I ask you something personal?" "I suppose that depends on how personal," he replied with a slight smile. "When you decided to leave the law and come west, was it worth it? Giving up everything familiar for the chance at something better?" Jax was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains barely visible against the star-filled sky. "Ask me again in a year," he said finally. "When we see whether you succeed in building the kind of school you're dreaming of, whether the children of Silver Creek grow up with broader horizons because you had the courage to demand better for them. Ask me then if it was worth giving up safety for the chance to matter." "Why does my success matter so much to you?" Catherine asked softly. "Because watching you fight for your dreams reminds me why I fought for mine," Jax replied, his voice rough with honesty. "Because seeing someone refuse to settle for less than they're capable of makes me believe that maybe the world really can change for the better." Catherine felt her heart racing at the intensity in his voice, at the way he was looking at her, as if she were something precious and powerful and necessary all at once. "Jax," she began, but he stepped back before she could continue. "Good night, Catherine," he said gently. "Classes start Monday. You're going to change these children's lives, and they're going to be better people because of it." As Catherine watched him walk away into the darkness, she felt a complex mixture of anticipation and apprehension about the future. Monday would bring her first day with the children of Silver Creek, her first real test as an educator. But it would also bring continued scrutiny from people like Henry Walsh, continued threats from men like Marcus Reeves, and the ongoing challenge of proving that her radical ideas about education could produce real results. Standing on the hotel steps in the crisp mountain air, Catherine Reed made a promise to herself and to the sleeping town around her. She would give these children everything she had, every skill, every passion, every dream she'd carried west. She would show them that intelligence and curiosity were gifts to be celebrated, not problems to be suppressed. And if that made her a target for those who preferred ignorance and intimidation, so be it. The frontier demanded courage in many forms. Tomorrow, Catherine would discover what kind of courage it took to transform young minds while dangerous men watched from the shadows waiting for any sign of weakness or failure. But tonight, with Jax's words still echoing in her mind and the vast Montana sky stretched endlessly above her, Catherine felt ready for whatever challenges Monday might bring. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Catherine woke before dawn, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves that she hadn't felt since her first day student teaching in Boston. But this was different. These children would be entirely her responsibility, their future shaped by the decisions she made in the coming months. She dressed carefully in her most practical teaching dress, a dark blue wool that wouldn't show chalk dust, and pinned her hair back in a style that was both professional and severe enough to command respect. The mirror reflected back a woman who looked older than her 26 years, marked by determination and perhaps just a touch of the steel her father had always said she'd inherited from her grandmother. The walk to the schoolhouse took her past businesses just opening for the day. Mrs. Patterson waved from the hotel doorway, and the blacksmith nodded respectfully as she passed his shop. But Catherine also noticed the way conversation stopped when she approached the curious glances that followed her progress down Main Street. Word of Saturday night's confrontation with Reeves had clearly spread, and she could feel the weight of the community's expectations, both hopeful and skeptical, following her like shadows. The schoolhouse was still and quiet when she arrived. Morning sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate the carefully arranged desks and the lesson plan she'd written on the blackboard in careful script. Catherine stood at the front of the empty classroom, taking a moment to center herself before the day began. She was arranging books on her desk when she heard the first tentative footsteps on the front porch. A small girl with blonde braids peered around the doorframe, her blue eyes wide with curiosity and shyness. "Good morning," Catherine said warmly, crouching down to the child's eye level. "You must be one of my students. I'm Miss Reed." "I'm Emma," the girl whispered, clutching a worn primer against her chest. "Mama said I should come early to help if you needed anything." "That's very thoughtful of your mother and very brave of you to be first," Catherine replied, making a mental note to thank whatever parent had sent this sweet ambassador. "Would you like to help me arrange the reading corner? I think the books would look better if they were organized by the children who will be using them." Emma's face lit up with the pleasure of being given a real task, and she set to work with the serious concentration that Catherine remembered from her own childhood. They worked together in comfortable quiet until other children began arriving in small groups, some eager and chattering, others hanging back uncertainly. Tommy Chen arrived with his younger sister Lily, both of them impeccably dressed despite the family's modest circumstances. Tommy's dark eyes were bright with intelligence and curiosity, and when he saw the mathematics problems Catherine had written on a corner of the blackboard, he moved closer to study them with obvious interest. "Those are harder than what Mrs. Henderson used to give us," observed a tall boy with sandy hair and the kind of confident bearing that marked him as a natural leader among his peers. "You must be Sean Murphy," Catherine said, recognizing the Irish accent she'd heard from his mother. "And you're absolutely right. They are harder. Do you think that's a problem?" Sean considered this seriously. "Depends on whether you're going to help us figure them out or just expect us to know how already." "Oh, I'm definitely going to help you figure them out," Catherine assured him. "But I'm also going to expect you to think, to ask questions, to make mistakes and learn from them. Is that something you're willing to try?" "I suppose we'll find out," Sean replied with a grin that suggested he was looking forward to the challenge. By 8:00, 21 children had assembled, ranging in age from 6-year-old Emma to 15-year-old Ben Crawford, whose work-calloused hands and serious demeanor marked him as someone who'd already begun the transition from childhood to adult responsibility. Catherine could see immediately that the age range would present challenges, keeping the younger children engaged, while not boring the older ones would require careful planning and flexibility. "Good morning, class." Catherine began standing at the front of the room with her hands clasped calmly in front of her. "I know some of you are wondering what to expect from me, since I'm sure you've heard that I do things differently than Mrs. Henderson did. So let me start by telling you what I believe about learning." She moved away from behind the desk, walking among the students as she spoke. "I believe that every one of you has a mind capable of understanding complex ideas, solving difficult problems, and creating things that don't exist yet. I believe that asking questions is more important than knowing answers, and that making mistakes is how we learn to do better. A hand shot up from the back row, a girl of perhaps 12 with serious dark eyes and the kind of intense focus that suggested deep thinking. Yes, Catherine encouraged. I'm Ruth Johansson, the girl said. My father says too much thinking makes girls unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. What do you say to that? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Catherine could feel the attention of every child in the room focusing on her response. This was clearly a test not just of her teaching philosophy, but of her courage to defend it when challenged. I say your father loves you and wants to protect you from disappointment, Catherine replied carefully. But I also think he's wrong about what makes a woman suitable for anything. The most successful wives and mothers I know are those who can think clearly, solve problems, and adapt when circumstances change. Intelligence isn't something that makes you less capable of love. It makes you more capable of everything. Ruth's smile was small but brilliant, and Catherine could see several other girls sitting up straighter in their seats. The boys, meanwhile, were watching this exchange with fascination, as if they'd never considered that girls might have opinions worth defending. Now then, Catherine continued, moving back toward the blackboard. Let's start with something that will challenge all of you. I want each of you to write down one question about anything at all that you've always wondered about but never had the chance to ask. Anything? Asked a freckled boy whose skeptical expression suggested he was testing the boundaries. Anything appropriate for a classroom discussion, Catherine clarified with a smile. But yes, I want to know what you're genuinely curious about. Science history, mathematics literature, how things work, why people behave the way they do, whatever interests you most. For the next few minutes, the only sound was the scratching of pencils on paper as the children worked. Catherine walked among them, noting the serious concentration on their faces and the way they seemed to be really thinking about their responses rather than just writing down the first thing that came to mind. When they finished, Catherine collected the papers and began reading them aloud, treating each question with genuine respect and interest. Why do some people have different colored skin? From Emma the youngest. If the earth is round, why don't people on the bottom fall off? From Tommy Chen. Why don't women get to vote if they have to follow the same laws as men? From Ruth Johansson. How do you know if what you believe is actually true? From Ben Crawford the oldest. Each question sparked a brief discussion with Catherine, encouraging the children to share their thoughts and theories before offering her own explanations. She watched their faces light up as they realized that their curiosity was valued, that their ideas mattered, that learning could be a conversation rather than a lecture. The morning flew by as they worked through mathematics problems that required reasoning rather than rote memorization, read passages from literature that raised moral questions worth debating, and began a geography lesson that connected their isolated mountain community to the wider world beyond. It was during the midday break that Catherine noticed Ben Crawford lingering behind, while the other children ran outside to play. "Something on your mind, Ben?" she asked, as she organized papers on her desk. "Yes, ma'am. I was wondering." He paused, seeming to struggle with how to phrase his question. "My pa says I should quit school after this year, start working in the mine full-time. Says there's no point in learning things that won't help me dig silver out of the ground." Catherine looked at the serious young man before her, seeing intelligence and ambition warring with family loyalty and practical necessity. This was exactly the kind of situation her teaching philosophy was designed to address, helping students see possibilities beyond the limitations others imposed on them. "What do you think about your father's plan?" she asked carefully. "I think mining's honest work and I'm not ashamed of it," Ben replied. "But I also think there might be other ways to make a living. Other things I could learn to do. Problem is, I don't know what those things might be or how to find out about them. Ben, can you stay after school today? I'd like to show you some books that might interest you, and maybe we can talk about different paths your life might take." Hope flickered in the boy's eyes, quickly suppressed by what looked like years of being told not to reach beyond his station. "My pa wouldn't like it if he thought you were filling my head with ideas above my place." "Your father wants what's best for you," Catherine said gently. "Maybe we can find a way to show him that education isn't about rejecting where you come from, it's about having more choices about where you go." The afternoon session focused on writing with Catherine, asking each student to describe something they'd observed on their way to school that morning. She was amazed by the quality of their observations, the way Emma noticed how morning frost made spiderwebs look like jewelry, how Tommy described the mathematical precision of a flock of geese flying south, how Ruth captured the social dynamics she'd witnessed at the general store. "You're all natural writers," Catherine told them as they shared their work. "You see details, you make connections, you understand that the world around you is full of stories worth telling. That's a gift, and it's one we're going to develop together." As the school day ended and children began gathering their belongings, Catherine felt a deep satisfaction she'd never experienced in her practice teaching. These students were engaged, curious, eager to learn everything she'd hoped for and more. Their enthusiasm convinced her that her methods could work, that she could make a real difference in their lives. She was erasing the blackboard when Tommy Chen approached her desk, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Reed, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Tommy." "Yesterday my father heard some men talking at the store. They said you might bring trouble to Silver Creek, that some people don't like the way you teach. Is that true?" Catherine set down her eraser and gave Tommy her full attention. "There are people who believe children should only learn what their parents learned, who think questioning and curiosity are dangerous. But Tommy, let me ask you something. Did you enjoy today? Did you learn things that interested you?" "Yes, ma'am. More than any school day I can remember." "Then those people are wrong. Learning should be exciting, challenging, rewarding. If that brings trouble, then I suppose we'll deal with trouble." Tommy nodded seriously. "My mother says brave people always face trouble, but that's what makes them brave." "Your mother is a very wise woman." After Tommy left, Catherine stayed to prepare lessons for the next day, but her concentration was broken by the sound of raised voices from the street. She moved to the window and saw a small crowd gathered outside Morrison's store, their postures suggesting heated discussion rather than casual conversation. Curious despite herself, Catherine locked the schoolhouse and walked toward the disturbance. As she drew closer, she could make out individual voices and realized the discussion centered on her teaching methods. "I'm telling you, Thomas, my boy, came home asking questions I couldn't answer," Henry Walsh was saying, his tone agitated. "Questions about why things are the way they are, whether they have to stay that way. That's not education, that's agitation. Maybe if you can't answer your boy's questions, you should learn the answers instead of blaming the teacher," came Sarah Chen's accented but firm voice. "My Tommy, he excited about school for first time ever. That is good thing." "It's a dangerous thing," Walsh shot back. "Children need to learn their place, not question everything they're told." "Whose place?" demanded Ruth Johansson's mother, her Swedish accent giving extra force to her words. "The place you assign them, or the place they earn for themselves?" Catherine hesitated at the edge of the crowd, unsure whether to join the discussion or slip away unnoticed. The decision was made for her when Mrs. Murphy spotted her and called out, "Miss Reed, perfect timing. We were just discussing your teaching methods." All eyes turned to Catherine, and she could see the community dividing before her eyes, those who supported her innovative approach and those who viewed it as a threat to established order. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward to face whatever criticism was coming. "I hope the discussion has been productive," she said diplomatically. "I'm always interested in feedback from parents about their children's education." "Productive," Walsh scoffed. "Your first day and already you've got children questioning authority, challenging tradition. What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" "I'm trying to teach them to think," Catherine replied calmly. "To analyze problems, to seek evidence, to form their own reasoned opinions. Those seem like valuable skills for any young person." "And what happens when they start using those skills to question things they shouldn't question?" Walsh demanded. "When they decide their parents don't know what's best for them? Then perhaps we should make sure we're giving them good reasons to respect our guidance," Catherine suggested. "Respect based on wisdom and love, not just authority and tradition." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with parents taking sides and voicing concerns that ranged from practical to philosophical. Catherine found herself defending not just her teaching methods, but her entire vision of what education could accomplish. Through it all, she was struck by how passionate these parents were about their children's futures, even when they disagreed about what those futures should look like. It was as the crowd began to disperse that Catherine noticed Marcus Reeves watching from across the street, his expression unreadable, but his attention focused intently on the debate. Their eyes met briefly, and he touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been polite acknowledgement or subtle threat. "Don't let him rattle you," came a quiet voice beside her, and Catherine turned to find Jax approaching from the direction of the livery stable. "How long have you been watching?" she asked. "Long enough to see you hold your own against some pretty determined opposition. How was your first day with the children?" Catherine's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Wonderful. Challenging, exhausting, but wonderful. They're so bright, Jax. So eager to learn when given the chance. I think we could really build something special here." "I can see it in your face," Jax said with a smile. "You look like someone who's found what she was meant to do." They walked together toward the hotel as evening shadows began to lengthen across the street. Catherine found herself telling Jax about the day's successes and challenges, the questions the children had asked, the potential she saw in each of them. "Ben Crawford wants to stay after school tomorrow to look at some advanced books," she said. "His father expects him to quit school and work in the mine, but Ben has real intellectual curiosity. I think with the right encouragement, he could pursue higher education, maybe even become an engineer or lawyer." "That's ambitious," Jax observed, "and potentially controversial. The Crawfords have been miners for 3 generations, which is exactly why Ben should have the chance to be something different if he chooses," Catherine replied firmly. "Breaking cycles of limitation, isn't that what America is supposed to be about?" Jack stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Catherine, I admire what you're trying to do truly, but you need to understand the forces you're up against. It's not just about educational philosophy, it's about economic and social structures that depend on keeping people in their assigned roles." "You mean people like Reeves?" "Among others. Men like that profit from desperation, from communities where people feel trapped and hopeless. Start giving children dreams and tools to achieve them, and suddenly, those men lose their power." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Are you saying I should back down? Compromise my principles to avoid making enemies? I'm saying you should be aware of what you're risking for yourself and for the children you're trying to help. Change is good, Catherine, but it's also dangerous." They had reached the hotel steps, and Catherine paused with her hand on the railing. "Jax, can I ask you something? When you decided to stand up for what you believed in back in Texas, when you took on those powerful interests that eventually destroyed your law practice, do you regret it?" Jax was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. "I regret that I failed to protect the people I cared about, but I don't regret trying." "Then you understand why I can't compromise now. These children deserve someone who will fight for their potential, not someone who plays it safe to avoid trouble." "I do understand," Jack said softly. "I just wish understanding made it less frightening to watch someone you—" He stopped himself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air between them. Catherine felt her heart skip at the implication of his words, at the intensity in his voice when he spoke about her safety. "Someone you what?" she asked quietly. "Someone you admire taking risks you're not sure they can survive." Jax finished, but his eyes said something different, something that made Catherine's pulse quicken despite the serious nature of their conversation. "I'm tougher than I look," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "I know you are. That's what scares me." The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and revolutionary. Catherine's classes became the talk of Silver Creek, with parents stopping by at all hours to observe her methods or voice their concerns. Some days brought support and encouragement, others brought challenges that tested her resolve and diplomatic skills. The children, however, thrived under her approach. Tommy Chen designed a simple irrigation system for his family's kitchen garden, applying principles of physics and engineering Catherine had introduced during a mathematics lesson. Emma composed a story about a brave princess who saved her kingdom through clever thinking rather than waiting for rescue. Sean Murphy organized his classmates to research and debate the territorial government's policies on land ownership, displaying a grasp of complex political concepts that amazed the adults who attended their presentation. But it was Ben Crawford's transformation that provided the most dramatic evidence of Catherine's impact. The serious, withdrawn boy who'd expected to spend his life underground discovered a passion for geology that went far beyond simple mining. Under Catherine's guidance, he began studying rock formations, mineral composition, and extraction techniques with the eye of a scientist rather than just a laborer. "Miss Reed, Ben said one afternoon as they worked together after regular classes. "I've been thinking about what you said about different kinds of mining. What if there were ways to extract minerals more efficiently with less danger to the workers?" "What do you mean?" Catherine asked, setting down the geology textbook she'd ordered from Denver. "Well, I've been watching my father and his crew, and I noticed they spend a lot of time dealing with water seepage and cave-ins. What if someone could design better support structures or drainage systems that worked more effectively?" Catherine felt a thrill of excitement as she recognized the birth of genuine scientific inquiry. "Ben, what you're describing is engineering, the application of scientific principles to solve practical problems. Could I learn to do that? Could someone like me actually become an engineer?" "Someone exactly like you," Catherine said firmly. "Someone who understands the problems because he's lived with them, but who also has the intellectual tools to develop solutions." The conversation was interrupted by voices outside the schoolhouse, not the cheerful chatter of children, but the harsh tones of angry adults. Catherine moved to the window and saw a group of men approaching their postures, suggesting trouble. "Ben, gather your books," she said quietly. "It might be best if you left through the back door." "I'm not leaving you to face trouble alone," Ben replied, his young face set with determination. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Ben interrupted. "You're fighting for my future Miss Reed. That makes it my fight, too." The front door opened without ceremony, and Henry Walsh strode in, followed by 3 other men Catherine recognized as parents of her students. Their expressions ranged from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "Miss Reed, Walsh said without preamble. "We need to talk." "Of course, Mr. Walsh, though I should point out that this is still school hours and Ben is my student." "Yes, we're aware of your special attention to young Crawford," said Carl Stevens, whose daughter Mary was one of Catherine's brightest pupils. "That's part of what we came to discuss." Catherine moved protectively closer to Ben, who stood straighter, despite the obvious tension. "I'm not sure I understand your concern." "The concern," Walsh said, his voice rising, "is that you're filling these children's heads with impossible dreams, making them dissatisfied with honest work, with the lives their families have built here." "I'm helping them discover their potential," Catherine replied evenly. "Surely that's what any parent would want for their child." "Not when that potential leads them away from family, community, everything they've been raised to value," Stevens shot back. "My Mary came home yesterday talking about studying medicine. Medicine Miss Reed. As if a girl from Silver Creek could ever become a doctor." "Why couldn't she?" Catherine asked. "If Mary has the intelligence and determination, because it's not natural." Walsh exploded. "Because children should be grateful for what their parents achieved, not constantly reaching for things that are beyond them." Ben stepped forward, his voice steady despite his youth. "Mr. Walsh, with respect, why should I be grateful for a life that keeps me underground in dangerous conditions when I might be able to find safer, better ways to do the same work?" "Because that's your place, boy, your father's place, your grandfather's place." "My place is what I make it," Ben interrupted, and Catherine felt a surge of pride at his courage. "Miss Reed isn't filling my head with impossible dreams. She's showing me that dreams don't have to be impossible." The argument that followed was heated and personal, with the men voicing fears about social disruption, economic instability, and the breakdown of traditional family structures. Catherine found herself defending not just her teaching methods, but her entire vision of human potential and social progress. It was during this confrontation that Marcus Reeves chose to make another appearance. He didn't enter the schoolhouse directly, but his presence outside the windows was unmistakable, a silent reminder of the more dangerous opposition Catherine faced. "Gentlemen," came Sheriff Morrison's voice from the doorway, "I think this discussion has gone on long enough for today." The interruption diffused some of the immediate tension, but Catherine could see that fundamental differences hadn't been resolved. As the men filed out, still muttering among themselves, She realized that her experiment in progressive education had reached a critical juncture. "You're making enemies," Ben observed quietly once they were alone. "Yes," Catherine agreed, "but I'm also making a difference. The question is whether I can do enough good before the enemies organize to stop me." That evening, Catherine found herself walking restlessly through Silver Creek's quiet streets, thinking about the choices that lay ahead. She could modify her approach, focus on basic skills and conventional curriculum, avoid the conversations that were beginning to divide the community. It would be safer, more sustainable, and infinitely more disappointing. Or she could continue pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions, fighting for every child's right to discover their full potential. It would be dangerous, potentially futile, and exactly what she'd come west to accomplish. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the figure following her until she reached the edge of town where the last buildings gave way to open prairie. Only then did she hear the footsteps behind her and turn to find Marcus Reeves emerging from the shadows. "Out for an evening stroll, Miss Reed?" he asked pleasantly, but his positioning blocked her direct route back to town. "The evening air helps me think," Catherine replied, her hand moving automatically toward her hidden gun. "Though I seem to have walked farther than intended." "Easy to do when you're wrestling with difficult decisions," Reeves observed, "and I imagine you have some very difficult decisions to make soon." "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. You see, Miss Reed, your little educational experiment is causing complications. People are starting to ask uncomfortable questions, challenge established arrangements. That kind of thing can be very disruptive to business." Catherine felt fear and anger warring in her chest. Children learning to think critically is only disruptive to businesses that depend on ignorance and desperation. "Careful, schoolmarm," Reeves said, his pleasant tone taking on a harder edge. "You're walking a dangerous line, pushing for changes that certain people won't tolerate." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Reeves?" "I'm warning you. There's a difference, though. I admit it can be hard to tell sometimes." He stepped closer, and Catherine could smell whiskey on his breath, see the cold calculation in his eyes. Smart women know when to pull back, when to find safer ways to make their mark on the world. "And what if I'm not feeling particularly smart tonight?" Catherine asked, surprised by her own boldness. Reeves smiled, and it was the most frightening expression she'd ever seen. "Then I suppose we'll find out just how dangerous stupidity can be in a place like this." The sound of hoofbeats approaching fast made both of them turn toward town. In the gathering darkness, Catherine could make out a lone rider pushing his horse hard across the prairie. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Jax's silhouette and felt a rush of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. "Problem here?" Jax asked as he reined in his horse, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "No problem at all," Reeves replied smoothly. "Just having a friendly conversation with our school teacher about the realities of frontier life." "Conversation's over," Jax said flatly. "Miss Reed, I'll escort you back to town." For a moment, Catherine thought Reeves might push the confrontation further, but after a tense pause, he touched his hat brim in another of his mocking salutes. "Until next time, Miss Reed, I do hope you'll give serious thought to our discussion." As Reeves melted back into the darkness, Jax dismounted and offered Catherine his arm. She was grateful for the support as her legs were shaking more than she cared to admit. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked back toward the lights of Silver Creek. "What were you thinking walking out here alone after dark?" Jax asked, his voice rough with concern and anger. "I needed to think to clear my head. I didn't realize how far I'd walked." "Catherine, you can't take risks like that. Not with Reeves watching your every move, looking for opportunities to—" He stopped himself, but she could hear the fear in his voice. "To what? What exactly is he capable of?" Jax was quiet for a long moment. "More than you want to know, and now he's made it clear that your teaching methods are threatening his interests. That makes you a target." They walked in silence for several minutes, the weight of the day's events settling over Catherine like a heavy blanket. She was beginning to understand that her vision of progressive education couldn't exist in isolation from the larger political and economic forces that shaped frontier life. "Jax," she said as they reached the hotel steps, "if I continue down this path, if I keep pushing for the kind of changes these children deserve, what do you think will happen? Honestly, I think you'll make some remarkable differences in individual lives and you'll make some very dangerous enemies who won't hesitate to use violence to protect their interests. And if I back down, if I compromise, teach a more conventional curriculum, you'll be safer. You'll probably keep your job, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been if you'd had the courage to follow through on your convictions. Catherine looked up at the stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, thinking about Ben Crawford's dreams of engineering Tommy Chen's scientific curiosity, Ruth Johansson's questions about women's rights, and all the other sparks of potential she'd glimpsed in her brief time as their teacher. "Then I suppose I know what I have to do," she said quietly. "I was afraid you'd say that," Jax replied, but his voice carried pride as well as worry. "Will you stand with me?" Catherine asked, meeting his eyes directly. "When the real confrontation comes and we both know it's coming, will you be there?" Jax reached out to touch her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her cheek. Catherine read, "I'd follow you into hell itself if that's where your principles led you, but I'll also do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't come to that." The promise in his voice, the intensity in his eyes, the tender way he spoke her name, all of it combined to create a moment of connection so powerful that Catherine felt as if the very foundations of her world were shifting. Here in the darkness outside a frontier hotel facing an uncertain and dangerous future, she realized that she'd found something she'd never dared hope for a man who loved her, not despite her strength and convictions, but because of them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations, new tests of her resolve. But tonight, standing under the Montana stars with Jax's promise echoing in her mind, Catherine Reed felt ready for whatever storm was coming. The battle for Silver Creek's future was just beginning. The storm Catherine had sensed coming arrived 3 weeks later, not with thunder and lightning, but with the quiet efficiency of bureaucratic action. She was teaching her morning mathematics lesson when Thomas Morrison appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, his face grave and his posture suggesting the weight of unwelcome news. "Miss Reed," he said formally, "I need to speak with you privately when you have a moment." Catherine felt her stomach drop, but she kept her voice steady. "Children, please work on the problems we discussed while I step outside with Mr. Morrison." Once they were alone on the schoolhouse porch, Morrison removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "Catherine, I'm going to be direct because you deserve that much. The school board met in emergency session last night, and by a vote of 4-3, they've decided to terminate your contract." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting something like this for days. On what grounds? Officially teaching methods that deviate too far from accepted curriculum standards. Unofficially. Morrison's expression was pained. "Henry Walsh and his allies have convinced the board that your approach is too disruptive, too controversial for a community like Silver Creek. And what did you argue in my defense? That you're the best teacher these children have ever had, the test scores and classroom engagement are higher than they've been in years, that you're preparing them for a future that demands critical thinking skills." Morrison's voice grew bitter. "But apparently that's exactly the problem." Catherine felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same righteous anger that had driven her west in the first place. "When do they want me gone?" "End of the week. They're bringing in a replacement from Denver, a man with more traditional qualifications and methods." "A man," Catherine repeated flatly. "Yes, someone who won't ask uncomfortable questions or encourage children to think beyond their assigned roles in life." Catherine looked through the schoolhouse window at her students bent over their mathematics problems with the intense concentration she'd worked so hard to cultivate. Ben Crawford was helping Emma with a difficult calculation, his patience and kindness evident in every gesture. Tommy Chen had filled his slate with diagrams and equations that went far beyond what she'd assigned. Ruth Johansson was reading from one of the advanced texts Catherine had ordered from back east, her face lit with the joy of discovery. "I won't abandon them," Catherine said quietly. "Not without a fight. Catherine, I admire your determination, but the decision has been made. Opposing it will only make things harder for everyone involved." Harder for whom? For the children who finally have a chance to discover their potential. For the families who've seen their sons and daughters come alive with curiosity and ambition. Morrison's shoulders sagged. for you. Walsh has made it clear that if you resist this decision, he'll make sure no other school district in the territory will hire you. You'll be blacklisted, unable to teach anywhere. The threat was real and serious. Catherine had no family wealth to fall back on, no connections beyond the frontier to secure alternative employment. Teaching was not just her profession, but her calling, her identity. Losing it would mean losing everything she'd worked toward her entire adult life. But as she watched Tommy Chen explain a mathematical concept to one of the younger children, his face bright with the passion for learning she'd helped kindle, Catherine knew she couldn't simply walk away. "Then I suppose I'll have to make sure they don't succeed in silencing me," she said with quiet determination. Morrison studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I thought you might say that. For what it's worth, you have my support, and the support of several other board members and parents. The question is whether it will be enough." "It will have to be. These children deserve someone who believes in their potential, not someone who's content to keep them locked in cages of low expectations." After Morrison left, Catherine returned to her classroom with a heavy heart, but renewed purpose. She gathered her students around her and looked into their eager faces, seeing not just children, but the future of Silver Creek, the next generation of leaders, innovators, and change makers. "Class," she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I want to talk to you about something important. Sometimes in life we face challenges that test everything we believe in. Sometimes people try to stop us from pursuing our dreams or reaching our full potential." Ben Crawford raised his hand. "Is this about the school board meeting last night, Miss Reed? My father heard about it at the mine." Catherine wasn't surprised that word had already spread through the tight-knit community. "Yes, Ben, it is. The school board has decided that my teaching methods are too different, too challenging for Silver Creek. They want to replace me with someone more conventional." A murmur of distress rippled through the classroom. Emma's eyes filled with tears, while Tommy Chen's face set with an expression of determination that reminded Catherine powerfully of his mother. "But Miss Reed," Ruth Johansson said, her voice shaking with emotion, "you can't leave us. You're the first teacher who's ever made me believe I could be anything I wanted to be." "And I still believe that, Ruth, but believing in yourselves can't depend on having me here. The curiosity I've tried to nurture, the confidence I've tried to build, the dreams I've helped you discover, those belong to you now. No one can take them away unless you let them." Sean Murphy stood up from his desk, his young face set with adult seriousness. "What if we don't let them take you away? What if we fight for you the way you fought for us?" Catherine felt her heart swell with pride and love for these remarkable young people. "Sean, that's very brave of you to suggest, but this is an adult problem that requires adult solutions." "We're not children anymore," Ben said firmly, "not after everything you've taught us about thinking for ourselves and standing up for what's right. If you won't fight for yourself, then we'll fight for you." Before Catherine could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open and Charlie Morse strode in, his weathered face grim with urgency. "Miss Reed," he said without preamble, "you need to pack up and come with me right now. Jack sent me to get you." "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, alarm bells ringing in her mind at Charlie's tone. "Reeves and his gang hit the Morrison Ranch this morning, burned out the buildings, scattered the cattle. Word is, it was a message about what happens to folks who support the wrong kind of changes in Silver Creek." The blood drained from Catherine's face as the implications hit her. The Morrisons had been among her strongest supporters on the school board, and now they were paying the price for their progressive stance. "Anyone hurt?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Morrison took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. His wife and kids are shaken up, but safe." "But Miss Reed, this wasn't random. Reeves left word that folks who keep pushing for changes they shouldn't be pushing for might find themselves facing similar difficulties." Catherine felt the familiar mixture of fear and fury that had become her constant companion since arriving in Silver Creek. But this time the fury was stronger. Reeves had crossed a line by attacking innocent families, by using violence to silence opposition to his vision of how the community should function. "Children," she said, turning back to her students, "I want you to go home and stay close to your families today. We'll continue our lessons tomorrow." "Miss Reed," Tommy Chen said as the students began gathering their belongings, "my mother says that brave people don't run from bullies. They stand up to them." "Your mother is absolutely right, Tommy. and that's exactly what I intend to do." As the children filed out, Catherine could see the mixture of fear and determination on their faces. These young people had been transformed by their brief exposure to progressive education, had tasted the possibility of lives unlimited by traditional constraints. They wouldn't easily accept a return to the narrow curriculum of rote memorization and social conformity. Charlie waited until the last student had left before speaking again. "Miss Reed Jacks wants you to come out to the ranch until this situation gets resolved. It's not safe for you in town right now." "I appreciate the offer, Charlie, but I won't be driven away by threats and violence. If I run now, Reeves wins, and the children lose their chance for a real education. If you stay and something happens to you, those same children lose their teacher permanently," Charlie replied bluntly. "Dead martyrs don't teach arithmetic, Miss Reed." The echo of Jax's earlier words stung, but Catherine remained resolute. "I'm not planning to become a martyr, Charlie. I'm planning to win. And how exactly do you propose to do that against men with guns who've already shown they're willing to use violence?" Before Catherine could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the window. A group of riders was coming down Main Street at a steady pace, their postures and positioning suggesting purpose rather than casual travel. As they drew closer, Catherine recognized Marcus Reeves at their head, his cold smile visible even at a distance. "Get away from the window," Charlie ordered, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "And get down behind the desk." Catherine obeyed, but her mind was racing. Reeves was making a public show of force, demonstrating that he could ride openly through Silver Creek without fear of consequences. It was psychological warfare, designed to cow potential opposition and show the community who really held power. The riders stopped directly in front of the schoolhouse, and Catherine could hear Reeves' voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Afternoon, folks," he called to the small crowd that had gathered to watch the procession. "Just wanted to let everyone know that the unfortunate incident at the Morrison place this morning was completely avoidable. Sometimes good people make poor choices about who to support and what changes to encourage, but fortunately it's never too late to reconsider those choices." The message was unmistakable: support Catherine's progressive education at your own peril. Reeves was using the Morrison attack to terrorize anyone who might be considering backing her against the school board's decision. "Charlie," Catherine whispered, "I need you to do something for me." "Name it." "Ride out to every ranch, every homestead, every family with children in my class. Tell them there's going to be a town meeting tonight at the schoolhouse. Tell them it's time to decide what kind of community Silver Creek is going to be." Charlie stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Miss Reed, that's exactly what Reeves doesn't want to happen. You'll be painting a target on everyone who shows up." "The target is already painted, Charlie. Reeves made that clear when he attacked the Morrisons. The only question now is whether we're going to let fear and intimidation determine our children's futures." "Jax is not going to like this plan." "Then it's fortunate that Jax doesn't get to make decisions for me," Catherine replied with a steel in her voice that surprised even her. "I came west to build something better, Charlie. If I back down now, if I let violent men dictate what children can learn and dream about, then everything I've worked for becomes meaningless." Charlie was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read character under pressure. "You know there's a good chance this ends badly for everyone involved. There's a certainty it ends badly if we do nothing. At least this way we go down fighting for something worthwhile." After a moment, Charlie nodded slowly. "All right, Miss Reed, I'll carry your message, but I want you to promise me something in return." "What?" "That you'll let Jax and the other men handle the security arrangements for tonight. You may be brave enough to face down Reeves and his gang, but you're not bulletproof." "Agreed," Catherine said, recognizing the wisdom of accepting help where it could make a difference. As Charlie prepared to leave, the sound of Reeves's voice carried through the schoolhouse walls one more time. "Oh, and folks, the school board has made some important decisions about education in Silver Creek. I'm sure you'll all be very pleased with the improvements they've planned." The threat was clear. Reeves and the conservative faction were claiming victory, expecting their intimidation tactics to silence any remaining opposition. But as Catherine listened to the hoofbeats receding down Main Street, she felt a cold fury settling in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with righteous anger. These men thought they could use violence and threats to control what children learned, to limit their dreams and aspirations to what suited adult prejudices and economic interests. They thought fear would triumph over hope, that intimidation would prove stronger than love for the next generation. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Word of the evening meeting spread through Silver Creek like wildfire, carried by Charlie and other riders who fanned out across the territory to reach every family with children in the school. The response was mixed. Some parents expressed eager support. Others voiced concerns about the risks of opposing Reeves. Still others seemed paralyzed by fear of the consequences. As evening approached, Catherine made her way to the schoolhouse through streets that felt charged with tension. Groups of men gathered outside the saloons, their conversations hushed and their expressions serious. Women hurried their children indoors earlier than usual, and the normal sounds of a frontier town settling into evening quiet seemed muted and strained. She was surprised to find Jax already waiting at the schoolhouse, along with Sheriff Morrison and several other men she recognized as community leaders and parents. Their faces were grim but determined, and she could see gun belts beneath their coats that hadn't been there during previous gatherings. "Catherine," Jack said as she approached, "are you sure about this?" "It's not too late to call it off. Handle this through official channels." "What official channels?" Catherine asked. "The school board that's already voted to fire me. The territorial government that's 300 miles away and has no interest in local education disputes, or maybe the federal authorities who wouldn't consider this important enough to investigate." "She's right," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "Sometimes a community has to decide its own fate, for better or worse." As 7 o'clock arrived, people began gathering in and around the schoolhouse. Catherine was amazed by the turnout. Nearly every family with school-aged children was represented, along with many others who saw the education issue as part of a larger struggle for the community's future. The crowd included recent immigrants and longtime residents, miners and merchants, those who'd supported her from the beginning, and others who'd been skeptical but were now concerned about the precedent being set. Thomas Morrison, his arm still in a sling from the morning's attack, called the meeting to order with a voice that carried clearly through the packed room. "Friends," he began, "we're here tonight because we need to decide what kind of town Silver Creek is going to be. Are we going to be a community that values education, that gives our children every opportunity to reach their potential? Or are we going to let fear and intimidation dictate what they're allowed to learn and dream about?" A murmur of agreement ran through much of the crowd, but Catherine could also see pockets of uncertainty and opposition. Henry Walsh stood near the back with several other conservative parents, their expressions suggesting they viewed this gathering as proof of the dangerous radicalism they'd been warning against. "Before we proceed," Morrison continued, "I think we need to hear from Miss Reed herself about her vision for education in Silver Creek." Catherine stood and moved to the front of the room, feeling the weight of dozens of pairs of eyes focused on her. This was her moment, her chance to articulate why progressive education was worth fighting for, why the stakes in this conflict extended far beyond one teacher's job. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. 3 months ago, I came to Silver Creek with a simple belief that every child, regardless of their family's background or economic status, deserves the chance to discover and develop their full potential. I believed then, and I believe now, that education should prepare children not just for the world that exists, but for the world they might help create. She paused, scanning the faces before her and seeing curiosity, hope, fear, and determination reflected back at her. "In the time I've been your children's teacher, I've watched remarkable transformations take place. Ben Crawford, who expected to spend his life in dangerous mine shafts, has discovered a passion for engineering that could help make mining safer and more efficient. Tommy Chen has applied scientific principles to solve practical problems around his family's farm. Ruth Johansson has begun to envision a future where women can contribute their talents to medicine, law, and other professions traditionally closed to them. Those are exactly the kind of unrealistic expectations we're talking about," Henry Walsh interrupted from the back of the room. "You're setting these children up for disappointment and dissatisfaction with honest work." "Mr. Walsh," Catherine replied calmly, "what's unrealistic about believing that intelligence and hard work can overcome the limitations others try to impose. What's unrealistic about preparing children to adapt and innovate in a world that's changing rapidly around us? It's unrealistic to think that a Chinese boy can become an engineer or that a miner's son should waste time on fancy theories when he could be learning practical skills, Walsh shot back. And it's dangerous to fill girls' heads with ideas about careers that will only lead them away from their natural roles as wives and mothers. Catherine felt her temper flare at the casual bigotry and narrow thinking, but she forced herself to respond with reason rather than emotion. Mr. Walsh, 30 years ago, people said it was unrealistic to think that Irish immigrants could become anything more than laborers. 50 years ago, they said the same about German settlers. Every generation, there are those who insist that certain groups of people should know their place and stay in it. And every generation, brave individuals prove those limitations wrong. Sarah Chen stood up from the middle of the room, her accented but clear voice carrying powerfully through the crowd. My husband and I, we come to America because here we believe children can become more than parents. My Tommy, he is American child with American possibilities. Miss Reed, she shows him these possibilities. Why should we settle for less because some people are afraid of change? A ripple of support ran through portions of the crowd, but Catherine could also see the hardening of opposition among the more conservative elements. This was becoming exactly the kind of polarizing confrontation she'd hoped to avoid, but perhaps it was necessary to force the community to confront its fundamental values. Mrs. Chen raises an important point, Catherine continued. The question before us tonight isn't really about teaching methods or curriculum. It's about what we believe America represents. Is this a place where artificial barriers limit what people can achieve? Or is it a place where talent and determination are the only boundaries that matter? Pretty words? Came a new voice from outside the schoolhouse, and Catherine felt her blood chill as Marcus Reeves stepped into the doorway. But words don't change facts, and the fact is that stirring up discontent among folks who should be satisfied with their lot leads to trouble for everyone. The room fell silent as Reeves moved into the crowd, which parted before him like water. Catherine could see hands moving toward concealed weapons, tensions ratcheting higher as the source of the community's fear made himself known. Mr. Reeves, Sheriff Morrison said carefully, this is a private meeting for parents and community members. I don't believe you have children in the school. Oh, but I do have interests in this community, Sheriff, Reeves replied with his cold smile. Business interests that depend on social stability, on people understanding their proper roles and not getting ideas above their station. And what exactly are those business interests? Catherine asked, stepping forward despite Jax's warning gesture. Reeves studied her with the calculating look of a predator sizing up prey. Labor, Miss Reed. This territory runs on the sweat of men who dig ore out of the ground, who work cattle on dangerous ranges, who do the hard, dirty jobs that keep civilization functioning. Start convincing their children that such work is beneath them, and suddenly those men start demanding higher wages, better conditions, more respect than they're worth. Or maybe they start demanding what they're actually worth, Catherine shot back. Maybe they realize that intelligence and education could help them organize for fair treatment and safe working conditions. And there's the real agenda, Reeves said with satisfaction, turning to address the crowd. This isn't about education, folks. It's about political agitation, about stirring up worker discontent and social unrest. Miss Reed isn't trying to help your children, she's trying to use them to advance her own radical political views. The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Catherine could see its effect on the gathered parents. Fear of radicalism, of outside agitators disrupting their communities, was a powerful force on the frontier where stability was always precarious. That's not true, Catherine said firmly. I have no political agenda beyond believing that children should be educated to think critically and pursue their dreams. If that's radical, then I suppose I am a radical. You see, Reeves said triumphantly, she admits it herself. This woman is here to disrupt everything you've built to turn your children against you and everything you represent. It was Ben Crawford who broke the tense silence that followed, rising from his seat with the quiet dignity that had impressed Catherine from their first meeting. Mr. Reeves, the young man said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Miss Reed hasn't turned me against my father or my family. She's shown me ways to honor them better by using my mind to find safer, more efficient ways to do the work they've done by building on what they've achieved instead of just repeating it. Boy, you don't know what you're talking about, Reeves said dismissively. I know that Miss Reed has taught me to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate me through fear and false choices, Ben replied steadily. I know that she's shown me the difference between thinking for myself and being told what to think. And I know that a man who profits from other people's ignorance and desperation is exactly the kind of man my education should protect me from. The words hit Reeves like a physical blow, and Catherine saw his hand drift toward his gun. But before the situation could escalate further, Jack stepped forward, positioning himself between the outlaw and the young man who'd just challenged him. I think you've said your piece, Reeves, Jack said quietly. Time for you to move along. I don't think so, Blackwell, Reeves replied, his pleasant facade finally dropping completely. I think it's time this community understood exactly what's at stake here, and what happens to people who choose the wrong side. The threat was unmistakable, and Catherine could see the fear spreading through the crowd as parents realized they were caught between their hopes for their children and their terror of this dangerous man. Some began moving toward the exits, unwilling to risk their families for the sake of abstract principles about education, but others remained their faces set with determination that matched her own. These were people who understood that some things were worth fighting for, that surrender to intimidation would poison everything they'd tried to build in Silver Creek. Miss Reed, came Tommy Chen's clear voice from near the front of the room. My family, we will stand with you. Education worth fighting for. As will mine, added Mrs. Johansson, her Swedish accent giving weight to her words. My Ruth, she deserves chance to become doctor, if that is her dream. One by one, parents and community members spoke up declaring their support for Catherine and her vision of progressive education. Not all of them, perhaps not even most, but enough to show that the community was divided and that surrender was not inevitable. Reeves watched this display of defiance with growing anger, his facade of civilized discourse completely abandoned. You people don't understand what you're choosing, he snarled. You think your noble principles will protect you when real trouble comes calling. But principles don't stop bullets, and high-minded ideals don't prevent buildings from burning. Maybe not, Sheriff Morrison said, stepping forward with his badge clearly visible and his hand resting on his gun. But the law does protect citizens from men who threaten violence against their neighbors. And right now, Mr. Reeves, you're very close to crossing a line that will put you on the wrong side of that law. For a tense moment, Catherine thought the confrontation might explode into open violence. But after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, Reeves stepped back with a smile that promised future reckoning. This isn't over, he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling on Catherine with unmistakable menace. Not by a long shot. As Reeves left, the tension in the room remained high, but Catherine could also sense a shift in the community's mood. By forcing people to choose sides publicly, the confrontation had clarified the stakes and strengthened the resolve of those who supported progressive education. So where do we go from here? Thomas Morrison asked, as the crowd began to settle back into discussion mode. We show the school board that they don't represent the will of this community, Catherine replied with growing confidence. We demand a new vote with all parents participating, not just board members who can be intimidated or influenced by outside interests. And if they refuse, Henry Walsh asked from the back of the room, then we establish our own school, Catherine said, the idea crystallizing even as she spoke it. A school run by parents who believe in their children's potential, funded by families who understand that education is an investment in the future, staffed by teachers who won't be silenced by threats and intimidation. The suggestion sent a buzz of excitement and concern through the crowd. Starting an independent school would be a massive undertaking, requiring significant resources and organizational effort, but it would also represent complete freedom from the political pressures and conservative constraints that had led to the current crisis. Miss Reed, Sarah Chen said thoughtfully, this independent school, it would teach all children Chinese, Irish, Swedish, everyone together. Everyone who wants to learn, Catherine confirmed. No barriers except the commitment to work hard and think critically. The vision was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so. But as Catherine looked out at the faces gathered in her classroom, parents who'd risked confrontation with dangerous men to support their children's education, young people who'd discovered the power of their own minds, community members who believed that Silver Creek could be more than just another rough frontier town. She felt a surge of hope that perhaps impossible dreams were exactly what the situation required. The meeting continued for another 2 hours with detailed discussions of practical arrangements, funding sources, and organizational structures. By the time people began departing, a provisional plan had emerged. If the school board refused to reconsider Catherine's termination, supporters would establish the Silver Creek Academy, an independent institution committed to progressive education for all children, regardless of family background or economic status. As the crowd dispersed into the crisp autumn night, Catherine found herself standing alone with Jax on the schoolhouse steps, looking out at a community that had been forever changed by the evening's events. "You realize what you've started here," Jax said quietly. "This isn't just about education anymore. You've challenged the entire power structure that men like Reeves depend on." "I know," Catherine replied, "and I know that makes what comes next more dangerous than anything I've faced so far. But Jax, did you see those children tonight? Did you hear them defending their right to dream, to learn to become more than what others expect of them?" "I did. And I also saw Reeves' face when Ben Crawford stood up to him. Catherine, you've made an enemy tonight who won't be satisfied with just running you out of town." Catherine turned to face him fully, seeing the worry and love warring in his expression. "Are you asking me to back down, to abandon these children for the sake of safety?" "I'm asking you to let me protect you while you save them," Jax replied, reaching out to take her hands in his. "Catherine, what you're doing is necessary and brave, and exactly what this community needs. But you can't do it alone, and you can't do it if you're dead." The words were blunt but honest, reflecting the harsh realities of frontier life that Catherine had sometimes allowed herself to forget in her focus on educational ideals. But they also reminded her of something equally important: she wasn't alone in this fight. She had allies, supporters, people willing to risk their own safety to protect her vision of what Silver Creek could become. "I'm not planning to do it alone," she said softly. "I'm planning to do it with you, with the parents who spoke up tonight, with the children who refuse to accept that their dreams are too big for their circumstances." Jax studied her face in the moonlight, seeing the determination that had brought her west and the steel that had been forged in the crucible of frontier challenges. "Then I suppose we'd better start planning how to build a school that can survive whatever Reeves and his allies throw at it," he said with a smile that combined resignation and admiration in equal measure. "Together?" Catherine asked. "Together," Jax confirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of hope and danger, and the vast possibilities that stretched ahead of them like the endless Montana sky. Standing there in the darkness outside the schoolhouse that had become the center of a community's struggle for its own soul, Catherine Reed understood that she'd found something more precious than safety or conventional success. She'd found her purpose, her people, and her place in the great American experiment of creating something better from the raw materials of courage and hope. The battle for Silver Creek's future was far from over, but tonight had proven that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And as Catherine looked ahead to the challenges that awaited them, she felt ready to face whatever storms might come, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer the woman who'd pointed a gun at a stranger on a dusty Montana road. She was a teacher, a leader, a catalyst for change, in a world that desperately needed people brave enough to believe that tomorrow could be better than today, and that she realized was exactly who she'd always been meant to be.